Well, good morning, all. It's Mike Kenny, the chairman of the iTalk. I have 9:30, so we will go ahead and begin the meeting. First off, welcome all to the March 2021 Independent Taxpayer Oversight Committee, or iTalk. Thank you, staff, for putting this together. For those of you who are on the phone or dialing in, special thanks for making the effort. Always look for public participation in our meetings. I'd like to confirm with the clerk that we do have a quorum. For the record, Francesca, do we have a quorum?
Yes, Chair, we do.
Thank you very much. Hey, this is a special day for those of us who work with the iTalk and Sandag staff related to TransNet. I'd like to say a few words in honor of Jose Nuncio's impending retirement. I don't know if you've all heard, but he has been shepherding this committee forward for many, many years, and he is going to go ahead and retire. I guess there's hope for the rest of us, and we wanted to wish you the very best. We're excited about the opportunities that your new life will bring, but we're truly sad to be saying goodbye to such an amazing person. Over your long career, you've made many connections and friends, and had a few of them here today to congratulate you on your retirement. We'd like to thank all the former iTalk members on the line with us today. I believe we have Jonathan Tibbetts, Kai Raymer, Greg Sadowski, and Paul Fromer. Carolyn Lee and Dick Fortman were unable to make it, but they send their regards as well. This might be the end of your time with iTalk in your current role, but your leadership has made a huge impression on us and will guide us for years to come. We have a parting gift that we'd like to present to you today. So I will go ahead and read a proclamation for you from the iTalk, both members, both present and past. Proclamation in honor of Jose Nuncio. Whereas Jose is one of the most steadfast, professional, and dependable individuals to serve the San Diego region, and whereas Jose is retiring following 19 years with Sandag, most recently as the TransNet Department Director. And whereas Jose has served the TransNet Independent Taxpayers Oversight Committee in the director capacity since 2014, providing expert insight into the financial management of TransNet dollars and the delivery of TransNet funded projects and programs. And whereas Jose is revered as an expert in all things TransNet and iTalk matters, instilling his wisdom and knowledge of local, state, and federal funding in all of us. And whereas Jose has developed a cohesive team of highly knowledgeable professional staff that will enable a smooth and seamless transition. Whereas Jose is looking forward to continuing to travel beyond Southeast Asia, the Americas, and Europe, exploring new places at least a decade before they become popular travel destinations. And whereas Jose has served the people of San Diego with his creativity, resilience, and commitment to ensure taxpayer dollars are managed with integrity and transparency in order to deliver transportation improvements which enhance the quality of life for all of San Diegans past and future. And whereas March 26, 2021 is a day for Sandag and the iTalk to celebrate Jose and his many accomplishments and contributions to the San Diego region, and is hereby declared Jose Nuncio Day by the iTalk. And therefore, be it resolved that the TransNet Independent Taxpayers Oversight Committee declares Jose Nuncio an honorary member in perpetuity and conveys this honorary proclamation to Jose for his 7 years of service as TransNet Department Director to the committee and 18+ years of service to Sandag. Thank you very much. Jose, we wish you the best.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I may, can I say a few words?
Absolutely, please.
I just wanted to express my appreciation to the iTalk. I think the iTalk is my favorite committee at Sandag. I really appreciate the time and dedication that its volunteer members provide to the citizens of this county. I really appreciate your probing questions, your scrutiny. You hold us honest, you hold us accountable, and you make sure that that we're doing our best to deliver on our promises to taxpayers and the region. So I really appreciate all iTalk members, present and past. So thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the recognition. I really appreciate it. And someone sent me breakfast. I don't know who, but thank you so much.
We were excited to have some of our past members be able to log in. Is there an opportunity or a desire for any of you to say anything? I appreciate you doing that. I cannot see hands, so speak up.
Jonathan Tibbetts here. May I speak briefly, Mr. Chair?
Mr. Tibbetts, yes, please.
I just want to thank Jose for always having good advice and good information. And also on those occasions where I put my foot in my mouth, you were always there to help extricate it. So happy retirement.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's great to see you.
All right, well, we do have him for one more meeting. So thank you for participating in that. All right, we'll go ahead and move on to our the regular flow of our meeting. Ariana, there are some direction that we need to provide to members who for calling in and raising hands. And if you could just go over those for us, please.
Yes, happy to do that, Chair. This is a friendly reminder regarding to our members and the public of the process for both member and public comments. Members will be using their cameras and we will take live public comments. Members are asked to turn on their cameras when they have a comment or a question, and then Chair Kenny will recognize you. And then, as noted on the cover page of the agenda today, in addition to emailing comments, the public may also provide live comments during today's meeting. And in order to provide live comments, you can join today's Zoom meeting through the link or by dialing one of the numbers from your phone that are provided on the cover page of today's meeting agenda. You can join the meeting by clicking on Join Webinar provided in the confirmation email that you'll receive upon registering. And then when public comments are called for on an item on the Zoom platform, you can click the raise hand icon in the Zoom toolbar. And then the chair will call on you by the name that you have provided. And if you are participating by telephone, you can press *9 and the chair will call on you by the last 3 digits of your telephone number. The instructions for providing live comments are also on the bottom of the cover page of today's meeting agenda, and that can be accessed from the homepage of SANDAG's website at www.sandag.org. And all comments, whether emailed or live, will be made a part of today's meeting record. Thank you, Chair Kenny.
All right, well, thank you very much, Ariana. So we'll go ahead and move on to item number 1, which is the approval of last month's meeting minutes. Before we begin, are there any members from the public who'd like to comment on this issue? Tessa?
I don't see any hands from the public, Chair.
And take it back to committee. Is there any discussion amongst the committee members with respect to the minutes? We'd entertain a motion if there are no, if there's no discussion.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to move for approval.
Vice Chair House, a motion. Do we have a second?
Second, Brad Barnum.
Brad Barnum is a second. Tessa, if you could call for the vote, please.
Thank you very much. For real estate right-of-way acquisition, Jonathan Frankel.
Yes.
Thank you. For licensed civil traffic engineer, Chair Kenny.
Approve.
Thank you. For contractor construction, Brad Barnum.
Yes.
Thank you. For biology environmental, Dustin Fuller.
Approve.
Thank you. For finance budgeting, Stuart Halper.
Approve.
Thank you. Licensed engineer Les Hopper is absent. For CEO private sector, Vice Chair House.
Approve.
Thank you very much. And that does pass with those members present.
Thank you very much. That takes us on to item number 2. Item number 2 is public speaking for any items that are not on the agenda today. So Tessa, do we have any members of the public who would like to speak?
No, Chair, I don't see any hands.
Thank you very much. I understand that we're going to take a few items out of order to accommodate some schedules. What had been item number 10 is now going to be heard directly, and that is the draft fiscal year 2021 Triennial Performance Audit. So do we have a presentation for that, Ariana?
Yes, that is correct. And I believe ITAC member Brad Barnum will be introducing the item and then passing it on to Kathy Brady and Leanne Liu with Schoberg Evershenk, your performance auditors.
Perfect. Brad, as the chair of the subcommittee, would you like to introduce the item?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Hassan, good to see you, and staff and past members of ITAC. It's great to see some of you. This item is the fiscal year 2021 Triennial Performance Audit. It is the 5th audit of the ITAC has conducted with the assistance of its performance auditor, Schoberg and Evershenk. It's been a privilege to serve as the chair of the ITAC subcommittee for this audit with Stuart Halpern, Sunny House, and Tracy Drager. A good group to work with, as was the subcommittee I chaired for the 3rd audit. It's good to see some of those members online from that audit. In addition to covering project delivery, program management, compliance, fiscal responsibility, and transparency, today's audit evaluated impacts of AB 805, safety in the region, the TransNet Regional Bikeway program, and the ITAC. I am pleased to report that the audit concluded SANDAG and its partner agencies have generally been compliant with TransNet ordinance provisions. SANDAG continues to strengthen its financial control, which is a good thing from a taxpayer standpoint. Areas for improvement include a better tracking system of ordinance goals and enhanced quality control for documentation. There could also be better collaboration between SANDAG and the City of San Diego on permitting issues affecting our regional bikeway program. I look forward to today's presentation and would like to welcome Kathy and Leanne from Schoberg and Evershenk.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brad, for the introduction, and good morning, members of the ITAC, past and present. I'm Kathy Brady, a partner with Schoberg Evershenk Consulting, here with Leanne Liu, a director with our firm, and we're pleased to present the results of our TransNet Triennial Performance Audit. First, I'll provide a brief overview before turning it over to Leanne, who will discuss key results and recommendations, and then I'll be back to wrap up and summarize next steps. So with that, let's get started. Next slide, please. As you know, the ordinance requires ITAC to conduct these performance audits, as well as establish the audit scope, which has included and focused on several different areas since the first triennial audit back in 2008. Some past scope areas have included project delivery, governance and oversight, procurement and contracting, environmental mitigation, and grant administration, just to name a few. For this current fiscal year 2021 performance audit, ITAC hired our firm, Schoberg Evershenk Consulting. We were established more than 21 years ago by the former California State Auditor, and we specialize in public sector audits and consulting, primarily in the Western United States. In addition to other government service areas, we have extensive experience with transportation and transit programs, capital project delivery and management, and construction financing. And as required by the triennial audits, our firm follows generally accepted government auditing standards, known as GAGAS, or fondly referred to by us auditors as Yellow Book standards, aptly named because they come in a book with a yellow cover. Basically, these standards provide a framework for audits, and it helps ensure objectivity, integrity, and quality that is achieved by auditors following many provisions related to independence and ethics and evidence, as well as provisions related to quality control, obtaining views of responsible officials, and the firm's undergoing peer reviews, where external auditors come into our firm and audit what we do. Complying with the standards provides an extra level of accountability for government programs through the audit's objective analysis and information, and it's really geared with the goal of helping government officials with better decision-making and more effective operations. Next slide, please. For this fiscal year 2021 triennial audit, we focused on the audit period between July 1, 2017 and June 30th, 2020, although we considered information past that point up until our draft report in February of 2021. As shown on this slide and mentioned by Brad, we were tasked with 10 focus areas. In the first area, we looked at project delivery of major corridor construction, looking at what's been done and what remains. We also looked at project management at the ordinance level, as well as compliance with the ordinance. For the fourth area, fiscal responsibility, we looked at financial models and fiscal safeguards. We reviewed transparency and accountability. We followed up on prior audit recommendation status and corrective action. A seventh area was AB 805, like Brad mentioned, the 2017 legislation that changed the SANDAG board composition and weighted voting structure, among other changes. Under focus area 8, we did a deep dive into safety. For this cycle, just looking at bicycle and pedestrian performance, as well as emergency planning and system capacity. Our ninth focus area was the Bike EAP, Early Action Program, looking at status, schedule, and cost. And finally, we looked at ITALK itself, focusing on qualification categories, member terms, recruitment, selection, and conflicts of interest. Next slide, please. Before Leanne describes the results and recommendations, I wanted to briefly bring your attention to the 2-page at-a-glance executive summary that we provide at the beginning of our report. It's likely much too small to read on this presentation screen, but our intent with the summary is to quickly provide a reader the critical recommendations and key results from each report chapter. We prioritize recommendations as critical, high, medium, or low, based on the impact to TransNet's goals or functions, critical path activities, accountability, or any time sensitivity of a particular recommendation. I also want to mention that several of the audit areas were in flux during our period, related to or dependent upon the currently in progress 2021 Regional Transportation Plan. So we found that finance plans were being updated, direction for remaining TransNet projects was still undecided, and even performance goals were tied to or still waiting for that finalized RTP that is estimated to be approved later this year by the board. So we had to base our conclusions on the best information available, knowing that it could possibly change once the 2021 RTP is finalized. Overall, as Brad mentioned, we found that SANDAG and its partner agencies really have made great progress and completed many planned projects as envisioned. Although the Bike EAP projects may not likely be completed as when expected. We found SANDAG was generally compliant with ordinance provisions, had strengthened financial models and controls, and realized improved bike and pedestrian safety in the region. We did, as Brad mentioned, also have some areas for improvement related to reporting against ordinance goals, enhanced quality control, documentation, and changes to the Bike EAP project permitting practices. So with that summary, I'll turn it over to Leanne to walk you through the details.
Thank you, Kathy. Next slide, please. In Chapter 1, we discussed the implementation status of the Major Corridor Program and the improvements that were envisioned by the TransNet Extension Ordinance in 2004. The main takeaway is that with only 16 years of the 40-year TransNet program passed, many projects were already completed or are in progress. But for the projects that are not yet done, ITALK and the SANDAG board need to know as they are moving forward with the 2021 RTP and making decisions about what to fund, that there is this portfolio of outstanding TransNet projects that need to be addressed. And what we mean by that is, with all the changes and the new vision for the region, SANDAG needs to be clear on whether these TransNet projects will be considered in the 2021 RTP or canceled because they may no longer be the best option or addressing the region's current needs. In order to do that, and when moving forward, SANDAG needs to crosswalk the major corridor projects from the ordinance to current status at least annually, so that decision makers and the public can better align past promises with current accomplishments of future goals. Next slide, please. Chapter 2 discusses SANDAG's fiscal responsibility as it relates to its financial planning to make sure there's funding available to pay for all TransNet programs and projects. In past triennial performance audits, we have delved into SANDAG's revenue forecasts, so the focus this time was on assessing controls and financial models SANDAG has put in place to address past shortcomings. With the renewed focus and improved fiscal safeguards functioning as intended, more light was shed on funding challenges that are not entirely new or a big surprise to SANDAG. But it did make the $9.8 billion funding gap for the major corridor projects more visible. And so with that in the future, SANDAG really needs to develop and adopt a formal process where any of these identified issues are discussed and options are outlined to show any impacts this may have on what is left to do for TransNet. Of importance with that is for SANDAG to clearly communicate how these decisions are made, especially when options to reduce, change scope, delay, or even eliminate projects are being evaluated. Next slide, please. Compliance, transparency, and accountability are key in government. And as discussed in Chapter 3, we found that SANDAG staff demonstrated commitment and were focused on compliance with ordinance provisions. That in particular shows with how SANDAG tracks and makes progress on addressing prior audit recommendations. But a key area where we found that SANDAG could do better is in the reporting on actual progress made on projects, especially status as it relates to details on cost, schedule, scope, and accomplishments overall, and how those align or do not align with what the ordinance promised. Next slide, please. Among the many changes at SANDAG over the past few years, AB 805 was a very visible one, as it did affect the SANDAG board composition and its voting structure. But as discussed in Chapter 4, in relation to how AB 805 impacted TransNet, we found that the change in board composition and the weighted voting did not significantly change the delivery of TransNet programs and projects. In fact, we found that the weighted vote option was only exercised 12 times over the last 3 years and only changed the outcome of the tally vote 3 times for TransNet-related items. And so there were no audit recommendations in this chapter. Next slide, please. If you recall, the last triennial performance audit and the 10-year look-back review of TransNet had identified a negative trend for bicycle and pedestrian safety. And so this time, ITALC had asked us to follow up to see how trends evolved over the last 3 years. As discussed in Chapter 5, the good news is that there were fewer bicyclists and pedestrians injured or killed between 2015 and 2018. But aside from bike and ped safety, we were also asked to conduct a deeper dive into regional safety planning efforts, especially as it relates to emergency evacuation or capacity planning for safety hazards. And what we found is that, like its peers, SANDAG did not get very much involved with emergency evacuation or capacity planning, although there was activity at the state and local jurisdiction level. But in terms of general safety, regional safety planning, there were peers that employed several good practices, such as designating a staff to coordinate safety planning for the region. Also, some peers had actually developed safety plans that looked at crash data, discussed targets, and described how efforts support and are coordinated with statewide DOT plans. As such, we recommend that SANDAG look into these items to further strengthen focus on TransNet safety goals. Next slide, please. Chapter 6 focused on the Bike Early Action Program, which was approved by the SANDAG board in 2013 and set aside $200 million to fund several bike capital improvements over a 10-year timeframe. That deadline is coming up in 2024, and with only a few years left, it is not likely that the program will be completed as intended based on the data we reviewed during this audit. Some of the challenges with the program are not within SANDAG's control, such as permitting delays with the City of San Diego. But what is important is that SANDAG needs to more clearly and comprehensively communicate these delays, project status, and cost information against plans and expectations so that ITALC and the board can make informed decisions about how to move the program forward. To be able to do that, SANDAG should more clearly in its reports to ITALC and the board present progress in terms of cost, schedules, and miles completed in relation to what the Bike EAP has set out to accomplish, and be very clear if those goals are still realistic or need to be adjusted on where the program is today. Next slide, please. Lastly, as required by the ordinance, each performance audit also looks at ITALC and any practices that could be improved. Overall, the TransNet ITALC is a very robust committee with qualification and expertise requirements that are similar to others. But since the world has changed since the ordinance passed almost 20 years ago, there might be additional expertise categories such as public transit users or performance measurement knowledge that could be considered. Especially as TransNet improvements evolve, additional expertise in areas that are contemporary with the latest in transportation planning and development could strengthen ITALC's oversight role. We also recommend that SANDAG could be more clear in recruitment materials about its conflict of interest policy and in more detail describe to prospective ITALC candidates how a potential conflict of interest does not mean that the candidate is automatically precluded from joining the committee. And before we take your questions, I'd like to turn it back to Kathy for next step. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Leanne. As you can see on this slide, today is the first presentation of the draft audit report to the full ITALC. After today, we'll present the draft report to the Transportation Committee on March 19th, and then again to the Audit Committee on April 23rd. After that, we'll finalize the report and bring it back one last time to ITALC at your June 9th meeting, and then move on to present the final report to the board at the end of June. This concludes our presentation, and Leanne and I are happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. Before we take it up to committee for discussion, Francesca, and I'm sorry to have referred to you as Tessa earlier in the day, but can you tell me if there are any members of the public who would like to speak on this issue?
No problem at all, Chair. No, I don't see any hands from the public.
Thank you very much. So let us take it back to committee for discussion. Do we have any questions for the presenters? I'm looking for hands. Let's see. Stuart, go ahead.
Sorry, I don't know if you were visually looking for hands.
I think I've got the hand thing dialed in, but I could be wrong. So feel free to speak up.
You know, this isn't quite so much as a question, but, and tell me if we can address this at a different time, but in the discussions on the subcommittee, particularly with regard to the ITALC and composition, one of the things that came up, and I just wanted perhaps Kathy to clarify why it's actually not in the presentation, is, you know, the audit is sort of somewhat backward looking against the standards in place at the time. And one of the things that we talked about was the notion of diversity and inclusion on the ITALC itself. It's not reflected in the report. Again, and Kathy, please elaborate if it makes sense, because there hadn't previously been a particular standard, you know, for SANDAG or the ITALC for which they could measure against. But one of the things that we did talk about with regard to the ITALC moving forward is the notion, you know, to try to focus a bit more on diversity inclusion. One thought perhaps to consider, as some jurisdictions do, the notion of an at-large type seat, which might make it easier for recruitment purposes. And there might be other ideas. But again, you know, we did talk about it at subcommittee, but because it wasn't something against which they could audit, it's not included in the presentation.
Yeah, maybe that's a question for me. So yes, we can definitely take a look at that. So as we circle back with ITALC in terms of implementing the recommendations, we'll make sure to include that as part of the discussion so that we can receive some guidance from the ITALC and the board moving forward on that. Thank you.
Other questions for the presenters from the committee? Oh, let me go over. I got 2 pages of people. Shoot. All right, I have a question myself on Leanne, chapter 5, bullet item 3. Can you have SANDAG transportation staff validate that bullet item? It's kind of a broad one, and I want to make sure we're saying the same things that other people are saying. not to be too coy, but I think between 2015 and 2019, we did see safety improve, 2019 being the last year that that data was fully reported, but things have changed since then. And I think we just want to make sure that that statement is the accurate one, that that is the same as other Sandag departments. So, and maybe we have to split up bicycle and peds because bad things are happening to bicyclists recently. So anyway, I don't want people to see that and detract from everything else because they have a challenge with, they've heard something different than that. So just make sure that TransNet or Sandag transportation staff are comfortable with that statement.
Okay, yeah, we'll make sure we take another look at that. Thank you.
Anything else from the committee members? Well, hang on a minute, Mr. Franco, I see your hand. Unmute yourself, please. There we go. George next.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Kenny. I have a couple of questions for staff, and my apologies in advance. Obviously, being the new kid on the block, there may be some questions that are kind of cover information that would typically be associated with trainings and others. But I think I think principally, the audit in various chapters suggests that there are limited processes in place to, on an annual basis, prioritize, modify, or eliminate major corridor ordinance projects. And it suggests that the extension ordinance actually never contemplated such a mechanism, or doesn't include such a mechanism. So I was just wondering, from a staff perspective, I know that there is a lot of annualized activity on, in quarterly projections of project costs, and other things that go on a regular basis. So do you concur with this general assessment that there are limited processes to kind of evaluate projects on an annualized basis?
I see Susan Huntington on the line. I'm not sure if she's available.
So this was maybe I can respond to that. So I think what the comment is about, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's a desire on the part of the reviewers to have Sandag maybe adopt a more formalized process to identify what are we going to do moving forward once we've identified deficits or a financial inability to complete all of the projects. And so I think what we've done up until now is have a more or less regular process through our plan of finance that identifies either financing opportunities or deficit issues in the short term, also in the long term. But I think what the audit is recommending is that we need to take the next step beyond that and identify what's the plan to address that. So I think that's what the auditors were getting at.
Thank you so much, Jose. And so I guess related to that, I think the audit was suggesting that from a scope modification standpoint, so obviously there's the plan of finance and there's an annualized process for understanding potential deficits and shortfalls, but is there a process in place whereby the scope of projects could be modified in accordance with anticipated budget shortfalls?
Right, and I think so we do have a formalized process through the annual program budget. So the budget actually includes, the scope of the work that we are working on. Comparing that more broadly to the TransNet ordinance, we also need to be consistent with the regional plan. And so if the regional plan changes the scope of a particular project that's included in the ordinance, we need to make sure that the ordinance itself is also consistent with that revised scope as it is now included in the regional plan. So it's sort of a continuous checking of what is the regional plan, including what do we have in our current budget, and if any changes need to be made, then obviously we would bring those to the ITOC's attention and to the board's attention.
Thank you so much.
Can I just add to that too? So Mr. Frankel, if you look in the Sandag program budget in Chapter 9, which has our entire multi-year, $9 billion multi-year budget listed and all the projects and all the descriptions. So from year to year, we will adjust each one of those projects, not each one, we will adjust projects based on what we know today. For example, sometimes we will add scope because we'll take advantage where the state or a local agency wants to add to our project to build something else. So the budget will increase and the scope will increase. Other times we will decrease scope based on budget. In fact, we did that with North Coast Corridor at the very last leg of the North Coast Corridor a number of years ago to try to save money to avoid a bridge widening. And so we will expand and contract the project based on the amount of monies that are available and try to be as transparent as can be with that.
Thank you, Jim. We have 2 hands raised for committee members, Ms. House and then Mr. Halpern. Sonny?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for staff, Sandag. I know you've reviewed the draft and just maybe some feedback, general impressions of what you think of the recommendations, if anyone wants to respond.
I'll take the first crack at it. I think, we appreciate the recommendations. I think all of us want to make the program better. We recognize there are certain things that we could potentially do more of, but we also recognize that to do more of those things is probably going to require, additional resources. And that's been sort of that balancing act that we've had. I would say probably increasingly more since the 10-year review and over the past couple of triennial audits, where additional responsibilities or additional work that the agency could do, it makes sense. It would be a great idea, but we need to balance that with do we have the resources to do that? And so that is what we would like to have our board obviously weigh in on.
And Mr. Chairman, can I also add to that one? Ms. House, so what you're going to hear in the next item is a discussion of exactly that in item 11. It's things like how we do performance measures and things, and areas like that that you've heard about on multiple audits. I'd also like to comment on the bike projects. So the bike projects and some of the delays are very well documented and very well known. We have always been extremely aggressive when it comes to our capital projects, our budgets and our schedules. A lesson learned on the bike projects is we're not working within our own protected right-of-way of a highway or of a railway. We're working in city streets. And so we were way too optimistic about what it means to push a bike project and especially impact parking on a city street, way too optimistic. But that's in the rearview mirror. We've corrected that. The delays with the city of San Diego, we've been making these incremental changes and tweaking it here, and it hasn't really amounted to much. Little improvements, but not much. But we have made incredible strides and real progress just in the past 1 month with Mayor Gloria and his administration. We have the mayor's personal commitment. We have the city engineer's personal commitment. We are actually sitting down now and doing a page turn. For those of you familiar with how engineers review plans, we're doing a page turn with all the city departments there and just saying, we're going to push these things out. And also some of the problems we've had on the bike jobs is not just the city of San Diego and some of the delays there, but it's also been with SDG&E because we're working in city streets with underground utilities that are some of the oldest in the region. And so I can tell you that Hassan I was on a Zoom meeting last week with Mayor Gloria, Hassan, and the Chief Operating Officer of, in fact, the CEO of San Diego Gas and Electric to try to resolve these things. So the bike jobs are getting a lot of attention, and I can sit here and honestly say that we think we've pretty much solved the problem.
That's great, Jim. Thank you for the clarification. It's really nice to hear that the city is focusing on this as well. So.
Chairperson House, my name is Ray Major. I'm the Chief Economist and Chief Data and Analytics Officer. And my team worked very closely with the auditors this time around, especially as it related to quality assurance and some of the data that we use in monitoring the TransNet program. And I think that they were very fair in their assessment. They pointed out some weaknesses in our processes that we are working on filling right now. But as Jose pointed out too, it requires additional resources, and we'll talk more about that later. But in terms of their suggestions, I think they were spot on in the things that they were able to bring up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Major. Mr. Halpern's been waiting patiently. Stuart?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. You know, just one other thing that came to mind when you put up that chart about safety, and I'm not sure if this might be a Hassan thing. I'm not sure if he's still around, but you know, one of the things, as Kathy mentioned, we asked them to look into the notion of evacuation planning and emergency capacity of the system, if you will. And they sort of reported back that, you know, evacuation planning capacity actually isn't really SANDAG's jurisdiction per se, and that SANDAG doesn't necessarily have a seat at the table with the agencies or committees, what have you, that really focus on that. And I just wanted to throw out that, you know, from a taxpayer standpoint, it certainly seems, you know, in front of the new regional plan, that if SANDAG doesn't specifically have jurisdiction, one would hope that those responsible would give you a seat at the table, and that you would kind of pound that table a little bit to get one, because it's just so important to make sure that the new regional plan is reflecting, you know, the emergency evacuation needs that we might have in various scenarios. Thanks.
I would just say, Mr. Stewart, we will welcome a seat at the table, and we'll maybe pound it a little bit to get there. But I agree with your assessment that SANDAG should be at the table.
Yeah, and if I may, Chair Kinney, also addressing Stuart's comment, I think it's an area that I think many municipal planning organizations are being confronted with. And clearly, the work now that Caltrans is leading with the studies on State Route 67 are taking a really close look at evacuation planning. We think that may serve as a model for the region, and be able to work both with the county emergency response resources along with the state and all the jurisdictions is an area that we see tremendous amount of benefit, but it's just new territory for, I think, all the organizations to work in this area.
Thank you, Mr. Trainer. Any other comments from the committee for staff or the presenters? Okay, so the item before us is to accept the draft proposal for its eventual presentation at the Transportation Committee and then the board. So any motions from Brad?
I make a motion to accept the report.
I have a motion. We have a second from Mr. Halpern. Any discussion on the motion? Okay, Francesca, if you could call for the vote, please.
Thank you, Chair. And just wanted to note for the record also that I don't see any hands from the public on this item.
Thank you. Thank you.
For real estate right-of-way acquisition, Jonathan Frankel.
Yes.
Thank you. For licensed civil traffic engineer, Chair Kenny.
Yes.
Thank you. For contractor construction, Brad Barnum.
Yes.
Thank you. For biology environmental, Dustin Fuller.
Yes.
Thank you. For finance budgeting, Stuart Halpern.
Halpern, yes. Also want to just add a compliment to Kathy and Leanne. They were great to work with on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For licensed engineer, Les Hopper is absent. And for CEO private sector, Vice Chair House.
Yes, and I want to ditto Stuart's comments about Kathy and Leanne.
Thank you very much. And that item does pass with those members present.
All right, thank you very much. With that, we're going to move on to item 11, which we're also going to pull forward in the agenda. This is a presentation by Mr. Dojan concerning the a TransNet extension ordinance amendment to administrative expense limit. Andre, welcome.
Chair Kenny, this is Ariana. I believe our Executive Director Hassan has some introductory remarks to provide.
Certainly. Welcome, Director Accardo.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Chair Kenny. Good morning to all of you. It's good to see you. I'm gonna not get into the budget detail, but I'm going to speak to you from the heart because I believe you will understand what's been asked here today. When the board hired me to come to San Diego late 2018, it was to transform the agency. At the time, the board meant business, and so did I. This was an organization in trouble. Years of underinvestment was showing. You saw the effects on our work and on our reputation. I remember my first Sandag press conference where I set out a vision for a world-class organization. And I said, we must find a way to pay for it. Within my first 90 days, we started a comprehensive organizational assessment. This was a 360-degree look at the agency's effectiveness, inside and out. We started to develop a strategic plan to create a roadmap for transformation. In recent years, several TransNet audits have made recommendations like the one you just heard from, and I do appreciate Kathy and Leanne for their work. And those audits, pretty much the recommendation that Sandag was not able to fully respond to. In my opinion, this was due to years of running too lean in too many areas. For too many years, Sandag has underinvested in the resources needed to strengthen our programs and practices. You just heard in this audit itself, and you heard from two of our executive team members saying that we fully agree with the recommendation, but we need resources to implement them. I want to share with you, I shared with you a look back where I have been, but where we are today and where we're headed is a different story. As you know, I came here truly to transform the agency, to build a world-class organization, to reimagine the future of transportation system in San Diego, to allow San Diegans to dream and to ask leadership to make sure these dreams come reality. And I can tell you my 2 years here, I've seen a tremendous underinvestment. Just to give you an example, when I joined Sandag 2 years ago, we had 5 laptops agency-wide. We have antiquated financial and HR system. We had no independent performance auditors in the agency. And right now we do, and it's understaffed. We're adding 1 staff to that office in this year's budget proposal. So we're asking you today to do something that, given the COVID-19 and the time, will be considered a political suicide on my part. But I really have no other choice, because building a world-class organization, while it's going to cost some money now, is going to save tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars. And you're going to hear from the staff, we have been really working hard in the last 2 years to transform not only the agency, but to transform the way we think about the future of San Diego. So today we're going to be asking the board to give us an additional $3 million for administration to fulfill so many programs that has been left behind. And I ask you for your understanding. And the reason I said I'm speaking to you from the heart, because yes, the timing is not right. Yes, COVID-19, but the cost of not being able to administer the program the way we should is much, much higher than $3 million annually. So thank you for allowing me to say a few words. My team is gonna move with the presentation, Jim and Andre and Ray, but I'll be happy to answer any questions in general if you have any, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll extend that invitation to other committee members. Are there any committee members would like to ask the director a question about his comments before we begin the presentation? Brad?
Hassan, good to see you. Thank you for your comments. I know You have big, bold plans coming forward, and things seem to be going well. Just a question, because you did write an audit, the appendix E in the SANDAG, in the ITALC, or in the audit, about sort of the need for some additional funding. I'm just curious, sort of the timing of this as it relates to the audit, and sort of the issues that Kathy and her staff brought up of some of the issues going forward that need to be addressed. So the timing of this is interesting because the audit just came out and you're asking for this money. So I'm just curious, sort of you can backtrack a bit of what was said in the audit.
You know, Brad, and thank you for the question. It's not just this audit. Definitely this audit is another one, but there are several audits in the past that made recommendations that were not followed through. Several. And you know, as an agency, we get over 20 audits a year. And I believe very strongly, and I think Mr. Halburn will attest to this. I want an agency with all the controls needed because I want to guard public funding. I want to make sure this agency is a world-class agency. So to answer your question, this audit, but many other audit made recommendations that weren't followed through because of resources. And it's time to stop that. That's not good for the future of the agency. But I appreciate your question.
Good, thank you.
Thanks, Kendrick. All right, so if we could go ahead and proceed with staff's presentation, we're anxious to hear that as well.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to take it from here. And let me just expand a little bit on what Hassan said, and basically what he's done in the past 2+ years since he's been here. Looking back, you've heard of big data. We've all heard of big data, and you're going to be hearing so much more of big data. You know, it's a data-driven approach that what we've been doing is really the first of its kind for an MPO. And imagine the future of transportation. That's what you're hearing about with the 5 big moves in the regional plan. You're going to hear so much more of that throughout this spring and summer. And what do? We used advanced analytics. And to give an example, what we were able to do is provide each city in the region with detailed reports about where people live and where people work, how they're getting around, where they're commuting. So therefore, where's the need for the improvement? It's those types of analytics. And I want to refresh your memory. When I saw Jonathan Tibbetts online, remember our collective frustration with trying to roll out performance measures for each city's TransNet projects because of lack of data. Going back even further, some of you might remember how basic and elementary our state of the commute report was because we didn't have the data or the analytics to produce a useful report. So that's just on the data front, looking back what we've done. On the legislative front over the past couple of years, we got a bill passed to give us more time to work on the regional plan. We got CEQA streamlining legislation passed for the Central Mobility Hub. Things like that just don't happen in the state of California. We got additional funding for the Mid-Coast corridor, something very near and dear to my heart. And then for what's coming up in the future, we're working, high-level agreements with the government of Mexico on Otay Mesa East and the new border crossing. And then finally, look at what we've done with the Del Mar Bluffs. We've made the Del Mar Bluffs both a state and a national priority. And with Hassan's conversations in Sacramento and with the CTC and with the Secretary of Transportation, Mr. Kim, we've received commitments of over $100 million to finally repair these things, something we've been trying to do for about 20 years now. But concurrently, we've got those same folks committed at a state and national level to find a permanent solution to move the tracks inland because, as we say, you can only hold back Mother Nature for so long. And, just in the past week and a half, ever since that latest failure at the Bluffs, it's become more and more of a higher emphasis for us and for the region. Okay, so that's the data and the government relations area. Let's just look at the finance area. During the same amount of time we're talking about, we've gone to Wall Street 6 times for new or refinanced funding efforts. That's resulted in $1.6 billion of proceeds to build capital projects. And the most important thing to all of us is this has saved the taxpayers. Andre and his team have saved the taxpayers $176 million. And that can build a lot of stuff. Even in this day and age, that can build a lot of stuff. In fact, what the bankers will say is that Sandag is one of the most active issuers of this type of transaction in the state of California. And that's also, as an aside, if I may, we asked Andre a week or so ago, as we're preparing for this presentation, you know, what do other public agencies do? You know, because right now we have no dedicated staff to do this. So all this refinancing work and the funding efforts, we have no dedicated staff. And what he found out in his research is some of the big cities in the West Coast have like 10 to 12 people managing this. And similar, and this is what really gets us, is similar self-help agencies like Sandag, you know, with local sales tax measures, have 5 to 6 people doing it. And then finally, just one other area looking backwards, I want to mention our most recent effort, which is in our commitment equity. And that's going to change how we plan and how we build in the projects of the future. So this is not the same Sandag, but, you know, we're just starting. And there's so much more we can do, as you heard from the auditors, as you heard from Hassan, to make us into that world-class organization that the board brought Hassan down to San Diego to do. So that's looking back. Looking forward, we can't continue to, you know, underinvest in these areas like data and finance, you know, and that data that gets us performance measures. We can't kick that can any longer. And by investing in the plan, investing in this 1%, we're able to better advance the regional plan, better position ourselves for all the funding people are talking about, not only in the statewide SB1 dollars and all the requirements that come under that infrastructure bill, but also the infrastructure bills that at a federal level they're being talked about. It's so obvious that this nation needs to make a continued improvement and investment in infrastructure. And it will also allow us to better, you know, gain your trust, gain our board's trust, and gain the public's trust, you know, going forward, which is so critical considering the amount of money we do spend and we do have authority. And just to finalize, just to reemphasize what you heard in the last presentation with Kathy and Leanne, some really good recommendations about how the world has changed. And Hassan mentioned that we need to act on providing those additional project controls, the targets, the monitoring, the reporting functions that will gain that trust. And so that's sort of building on where we've been, where we want to go in the future. But let me turn this over to Andre now so he can give you some real specifics. Andre?
Great, thank you, Jim. So as Hassan mentioned, you know, we will be taking to the board, the executive committee actually in 2 days, our draft budget, and then later this month, our board of directors of budget. And one of the things that we're going to be asking for is the potential increase of the TransNet by the $3.2 million. So again, we must start by, you know, right-sizing the agency's budget to align it with expectations of the board and the region. I think, as mentioned, too many years of underinvestment have left Sandag with a gap between expectations and the agency's ability to deliver on them. So we propose to remedy this discrepancy and to shrink the gap and prevent it from growing. So currently our admin fee is 1% off the top, and we're proposing to go to 2%. I just want to give you a couple examples of fellow self-help agencies and what they're doing. So the Fresno County Transportation Authority has a measure C. The admin allowance is 1.5%. Similar to ours, their measure is a 0.5% sales tax collected. Maybe an agency more our size, the Alameda County Transportation Commission currently has 2 measures, Measure B and Measure BB. Their admin allowances are 4.5% and 4% respectively. One measure is a 0.5%, the other measure is a full 1%. So for their Measure BB, they are actually getting in twice the amount of sales tax. And at 4%, that means that they're getting 8 times more in admin fees that we are currently. So in dollar terms, if our sales tax collections were the same, we're getting $3.2 million. They are getting $25.6 million. So surely we can see that what we've been collecting just hasn't kept up. I think we must also define what is contained, what we mean by the admin fee, by taking a look at what we did previously versus what we are doing today. Now, actually, I started my career at KPMG as an auditor, and one of my first and biggest clients at the time was Sandag. This is going back to 1988, when the first transit ordinance was passed. I actually helped the Sandag staff, the Director of Finance and Administration at the time, Wayne Sink set up the chart of accounts and the financial statements for the commission. Now, back then, admin meant accounting, compliance, reporting. And you just heard from our auditors here, Kathy and Leanne, that the world has changed. Now, 33 years later, admin is very different. It includes big data, advanced analytics, transparency, complex financial transactions, involved responses to audits, modern systems, performance-based planning and programming. I'll now just turn it over to Ray, who will discuss what we intend to do with this additional investment.
Thank you, Andre. In my professional opinion, what we're really doing here is just catching up on the investment and what it takes to actually monitor this particular program. If you think about the fact that this ordinance was passed in 2004, almost 20 years ago, my team right now is sitting on a database that we do the analytics for how TransNet works. That database is 150 terabytes of space. The terabyte database wasn't even invented till 2007, which was after the ordinance was passed. And nobody ever expected back then that we would have this much volume of data that we had to go through, to govern, to QA, to analyze, to be able to really monitor these programs. And when you take a look at the areas that the auditors have identified in numerous previous audits, they talk about things like consider region-wide allocation from TransNet or other sources for enhanced performance tracking, analysis, and reporting at the regional level. What they're saying there is more data analytics, collecting more data, QAing more data, analyzing more data, so that we can better understand how we're spending the dollars that we collect from TransNet. Another suggestion is that performance tracking and reporting for TransNet local streets and roads and environmental mitigation programs to make sure that they comply with state and federal performance requirements. These two are monitoring, and it requires us to collect more data. When we wrote this ordinance, or when this ordinance was passed in 2004, and Mr. Halpern, you would be very well aware of this, we had no formal data governance process. We had no QA process in place. It's not that we didn't do it, but it hadn't been formalized, and we had no monitoring process. It wasn't until 2017 when we found the error in the forecast that we started to implement these things. And what we realized is that we were really behind in building this infrastructure. There's numerous other challenges where we need to invest. I mean, SANDAG is challenged with demonstrating accomplishments or measuring outcomes in the TransNet program. This is because we need to apply data science to the data that we collect to really understand if these programs are working. We've been requested through some of these audits to do things like recommend that the best practices be established. And that's great. It takes people and resources to do that. And the audits also point out that we need to improve our documentation and transparency of our quality assurance programs, as you heard today. And so we're working in that direction, but there's a lot more now that needs to be done than was ever anticipated when this ordinance was originally passed. When you take a look at attachments 1 and 2 of the reports to this particular report, you'll see the first attachment talks about what we do with the first 1%, and then there's also one that it shows what the additional 1% would be used for. But I just want to make a comment on the data part of it. One of the things that we really need to do as an agency, and again, pointed out by auditors, pointed out by AB 805, is that we need to enhance performance monitoring. We have to enhance our analysis and reporting. And there's more and more data that's becoming available to monitor this TransNet program. Again, 20 years ago, there were no such thing as cell phones. And now we regularly use cell phone data to understand how people are using our infrastructure. And this data is incredibly insightful. And it allows us to optimize the billions of dollars that we're investing in our regional transportation system. However, it's not without cost. We have to do data science. We have to bring data science skills into the agency so that we can process the data, so that we can analyze it, so that we can interpret it. We need infrastructure in place so that we can ensure the quality of the data, make sure that there's data governance, and make sure that we make accurate interpretations of the information. A lot of this was pointed out in the 7-point plan. We're moving in that direction, but again, there needs to be a funding source from where we can pay for these improvements to be made. Big data analytics, again, what we can look at not just for TransNet, but throughout the entire agency is to really help SANDAG become much more data-driven and use data to make better decisions. And that's something that's going to be a spin-off benefit from investing in the analytics of TransNet, for instance. And so this really helps propel us beyond just the compliance that the auditors are asking us to do, but it drives us to a place where we're more open, where we're sharing data with our member agencies and the public, and where we have complete transparency, and we have potentially a tool like a data portal where people have access to the information that we collect. The data that we collect is a public asset. It's not SANDAG data, it's the data it's the entire region's data, and we need to find a way to make that accessible to everybody. And I think by supporting this type of measure, that helps us go very far in that direction. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Andre.
Great, thank you, Ray. So, I think one of the things I just wanted to talk about is the support that we have, the needs for the audits. I think we all know that AB 805 brought some positive changes, including the OIPA office that came into SANDAG recently. And it was unfortunate that this was a state mandate. We put in for a claim and it was denied. So basically, we have to have additional resources to pay for that. And I see, Mary, you've popped up, so maybe I can turn it over to you, say a couple of words on your office, your program, and the kind of support that you'll be looking from the agency going forward.
Thank you, Andre. Yeah, I would like to say a few words. As you all are aware, the independent performance auditor came about through AB 805. We've been here and established somewhat about almost 2 years now, and did just complete our first major audit. In addition to that, we did a risk assessment around the entire agency. And as a result of my office and the audit and the risk assessment, it's clearly understood that AB 805 was created for a reason, and that the costs associated with establishing an independent performance auditor's office, that takes resources. The board and really the governing of SANDAG needs to realize that there's 3 things that need to occur if you really want to see a government agency change, and that is commitment, a willingness to change, and the resources to be able to provide that change to occur. My office brought to the board, I believe, excuse me, last year, a very detailed analysis that supported the need for 15 auditors for an agency this size with the projects and funding this size. We were given and recognized that we needed 7 additional positions that would sufficiently, at least somewhat, help support the office and the audit function, which, by the way, really never existed in the entirety of SANDAG before the IPA was created. So you can imagine when you pull back those blankets, inherently in any organization, you're going to find things that need to be improved. As we did. And so though I'm, my wish list would be for 7 more positions, just not reality or realistic to expect that. But that 1 additional position will give us a little bit more resources. But on the management side, what comes along with that also is that there is a need to make change. You have to have resources, and a lot of changes that will be needed to be made are things that were recommended in this audit as well as in the audit that I just completed. And that is a commitment from management to really look at system controls and make improvements around controls, which there are many that are needed, around policy changes. And all of that does take resources. You have to be willing as a board to commit to those resources, both on management side and auditor side, to bring those changes, those identified improvements that are needed to reality. And if you don't, then it's just going to be more audits that have continuous and repetitive findings. And if you don't have the resources on both sides of the house to support those changes that are needed, they're only going to compile. And especially around federal and state pass-through grants, there are many requirements around documentation and performance measures and documenting those performance measures and monitoring those and outcomes of those. And if those aren't done, there's more risk involved and the risk of losing funding. And then we're just in a worse situation. So from my perspective and what I can see at this point in time, and we have a lot more to go, is that resources are required. So if you really want to see AB 805 do what it was intended to do, then the oversight boards and governing boards needs to understand and support that resources are needed and money is needed to provide those resources. And that's all I have, unless you have questions.
Thank you, Mary. I'll just make one more point before we wrap up. So, as we mentioned, part of what we do here in the finance department is to support the entire financial management and also pursue new funding opportunities. And, yes, it is my job as a CFO to go out and, do innovative types of financing. And recently we just went out and did the GANS bond issuance, which was the first time it had been done in over 20 years. People said you couldn't do it. Well, guess what? We got to leverage $331 million from our FFGA, and we actually won Bond Buy Deal of the Year. Just a year ago when the COVID hit, interest rates plummeted. We called the TIFIA office, and after 3 or 4 times, finally convinced them to allow us to refinance our loans. The first time that it was done in the country. Couple behind us just went, good for them, but we got rates that are 50 basis points lower today than just what they were a month ago. So we really got in and locked in the opportunity. And Jim did say that over the last 6 issuances, we've saved over $170 million. But if you just take the TIFIA, a refinancing that we did along with the short-term bans, that's $138 million that we saved. And if you extrapolate that over 27 years, that's $5.2 million annually. So in my opinion, we've already made the $3.2 million, plus there's $2 million left. Listen, I appreciate from time to time that Hassan mentions that I was CFO winner of the year, but we all know that that is a team effort. But unfortunately, over the last 2 years, I've lost 2 of my most seasoned people in the TransNet office and managed to keep 1 from leaving. Honestly, they are overworked and I can't keep up with our demands. And with Jose retiring now, this is certainly not going to help. This is not sustainable. In fact, just this morning, we were on a call with our bankers in New York. We have 2 deals going off this morning. One of them is 6 times oversubscribed. The other one is 10 times oversubscribed. Very exciting for us and for the region. That takes a lot of time, energy, and resources, not only on the front end, but even more on the back end with the financial reporting, the compliance reviews, investor relations, the EMA posting. Frankly, we don't have the staff, and I'm straining our finance department to the limit. Plus, as funding gets scarcer, we need additional resources to go out and find funds to continue to leverage our program. Finally, I just want to get into the timeline that we have on this item. Section 16 states that the Commission may, with a 2/3 vote of the Commission, amend the ordinance to further its purposes. Should the board wish to amend the ordinance, an amendment would be for board consideration for first and second readings in April and May of 2021. Thereafter, the amendment would take effect 30 days after its final passage and would be incorporated in the final fiscal year 22 SANDAG program budget. With that, Chair Kinney, that completes the staff presentation. Would like that to turn it back to you for any questions at this point.
Well, thank you very much. That was a thorough presentation. Thank you all. Before we take it back to committee for discussion, I'd like to check with the clerk. Do we have any members of the public who would like to speak on this issue?
No, Chair, I don't see any hands from the public.
Thank you very much. We'll start with Vice Chair House. Sunny?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I want to thank Hassan and the staff for your leadership and for really managing this program, the TransNet program, and others within the limitations that you do have. I think you all do a fantastic job, and we're really appreciative of that. I have several questions because this whole proposal was just kind of thrown at the ITAL committee very last minute. I have personally not had a chance to review everything that you have included in your spreadsheet. So I'm a little bit concerned about the fact that this is being presented this way and without much time for us to review. So I'll be concerned about voting or accepting anything like this until I've had a chance to review it. But my questions, for example, you did, Andre, talk about other organizations that have higher admin costs. What about those that do work within the 1% or 1.5%? Let's just kind of maybe balance this a little bit. How many other organizations such as SANDAG are working within the 1% or that range? Do you have any of that data to share?
We try to gather as much data as we can. I think in general, I would say many of the agencies are at 1% when their ordinance have started, but as agencies update their ordinances, it seems that they are ratcheting those percentages up.
Okay. Okay, and I can understand with, as time passes that, and the demands change, there's always a possibility of change. So I'm not rejecting the idea of looking at an increased administrative budget. I'm not familiar with all the funding sources that SANDAG uses to administer all of the programs that you're, holding or managing. But I do want to know, how does this work? I mean, TransNet admin cost goes towards managing the TransNet funds. But I see SANDAG engaging and embarking on this huge program of 5 big moves, which requires staff time. And so how is that managed, or the admin costs for that covered versus covering TransNet work? And how do you distinguish between all these different sources? Because what you've asked for is just in dollars, but it doesn't tell me if this is staff time, this equipment, software. It's not very clear from the requests yet. And I haven't had to read everything yet, so.
Yeah, Ms. House, maybe I can start answering that question and then let Jim and Ray come in as well. But I think, first of all, we do apologize for getting the document in late. I think, we've been talking about this probably for the last couple of years, really. And as we started gathering the data, it became a little overwhelming trying to put everything together. So we do apologize for putting it to you rather in a very abrupt manner. That being said, currently our TransNet admin projects for fiscal year 21 fund approximately 15 different projects and programs. And I think if you had time to read the spreadsheet, which I know you haven't, it's going to be approximately 24. It's almost doubling. And so your question may be, well, how is that going up that much? Part of the problem has been those projects that we are now really bringing into the fray that TransNet should be paying, should have been being paid by TransNet for several years. But since we didn't have the additional resources, we've had to tap into other resources, such as TDA monies to pay for them. But it's got to the point that there's only so much that can go around. And so all these projects that we're bringing in are definitely TransNet eligible projects. And it's something that we should have probably been paying on transit funds for many years, but we didn't have the resources. As far as the 5 big moves, maybe I can have Jim talk about that area.
Yeah, well, first off, Ms. House, yeah, we want to apologize. We know that we just sort of dumped this on you because, like Hassan said, this was political suicide, given this current environment to do this. So this was sort of as a last resort. but that doesn't mean it's not a wise thing to do. I can tell you, I think you can hear from all of us. We all think this is a wise thing to do. And this is not like, hey, you know what, here, we just downloaded this report for you yesterday and you have to make a decision. No, this is the start of the discussion. This is what the action that our executive committee is going to take on Friday is to give us approval just to release the draft budget to the public. That's all that is. And then the final budget comes to the board for approval in May. So we have a couple of months. And so obviously we can report back to you any discussions that they have or whether or not they give it thumbs up or come up with some other idea. So this is just the start of the discussion. We're really looking forward to hearing your thoughts, your concerns, your ideas, and things like that, knowing that this was all happened at the last moment for you. And I just want to repeat, as far as Andre said, as far as the regional plan goes, but it's the same thing. What we've been doing is we have been using flexible funds like TDA, if you've heard of that term before, TDA funds, to do things that TransNet is legitimately a charge for. But we haven't been able to do that because it's been capped at this 1%. We've just reached a limit. There is no more flexibility in the TDA funds to allow us to do that. And so that's why we are here, even though we've seen this coming for a number of years, like Andre said.
Okay, so I understand, I heard from Audit, I've heard from Finance that those funds are needed. I see it, how it's being requested as far as the increase. But you have almost over $1 million requests for government relations and interagency coordination. That didn't make sense to me because it didn't make sense as far as what are you going to do with that money and how does that relate to TransNet versus everything else that SANDAG has to do as a regional planning agency.
Perhaps Ms. House, I could try to address that. This is Ray Traynor. Yeah, one of the roles that our government relations team plays, among many, is the coordination with the board of directors in their role as the Regional Transportation Commission. One of the things that RTC does is administer the TransNet program. And so one of the things that we've received over the last couple of years with that org assessment that Hassan mentioned we conducted, that 360 review of the organization, was that our board members are asking us to provide more communication, more briefings, more detailed conversations about what's going on with the TransNet program of projects, what's going on with our planning activities. And that takes staff time. We've had to actually increase the government relations program to meet the demands of the board, which have changed dramatically over the last couple of years. So that's one thing. But the other big vital role that the government relations teams plays was what Jim was alluding to earlier. And that's the work to go out and take the TransNet dollars that we've got, leverage those, and try to obtain new funding from both federal and state resources. That takes an increase in terms of our work with representation or lobbyists back in Washington, D.C. We just went through a new procurement process for the first time in several years. And the costs for that lobbying work that's so vital to be able to help make the case for the region to the policymakers, those costs have gone up. And so that's another aspect of our work to try to be able to do more with the funds that we've got, and then to just be responsive. The environment we're in now, as Ray had alluded to about the use of data, the conversations have just gotten more complex. And I think that's one of the reasons we're hearing from our members of the board, give us more information, try to help us understand more simply. And again, that just takes staff time. So that helps maybe kind of give a little bit of an understanding of why we are requesting more allocation to support government relations.
Okay, thank you for the explanation. Back to you, Chair.
Mr. Barnum, your hand is up, sir.
Thank you, Ray. Good. Ray and Jim, those were good comments. And I think the fact that it's a start is important. I just think it's interesting, the timing of this with the 5 big moves and a potential campaign in the future. And the audit tells you that you still got some control issues and some of those other issues that were addressed. So I'm just wondering if the funding that you're asking for is going to be used to address the audit issues that have gone on, or is this going to turn into all the staffing that's needed for the 5 big moves?
Well, I can address that, Mr. Barn. Clearly, what we've done is, if you look at the spreadsheet that was included as an attachment that was just distributed to the ITOC, and again, apologies that this is moving a bit fast, but one of the things that we've really tried to delineate is that these increases are really to address the backlog of findings, recommendations, improvements. And again, this comes from really two sources. It's the myriad of audits, the new audits like Mary had talked about. I mean, these are new requirements that are coming in, and we all recognize, yes, we have to do this. But then secondly, that org assessment took the deeper dive into just how Sandag operates as a whole. And the world has changed. And so this really is to try to clear the deck, so to speak, of this backlog of work that we all know we ought to do, we want to do, and it's trying to figure out. We've tightened the belt as much as we can, but there's just only so much. I mean, Andre's staff are working weekends and nights. He's got a crew, and yet when you hear what we hear from the investment bankers, I mean, Sandag is like off the charts in terms of the number of transactions we do, the amount of savings that we bring in. And I think what you're finding is that we just can't sustain this. And we've had a history of saying yes, yes, yes. And I think what you're starting to hear, and I think what we're starting to recognize, and this I think is part of Hassan's leadership, is that we're recognizing that we've got to be honest. And we just, we're humans, and we've only got so much capacity to do more and extra. And our desire is to overachieve. But at the end of the day, we just don't have enough to do what I think everybody is expecting us and really demanding us to do.
No, thanks, Ray. That was very good. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Halpern, I see your hand is raised.
Thanks, Chair. I so much agree with everything that Hassan, Jim, Andre, and Ray, both Rays have said. And I really applaud you guys for bringing this up, because it's never easy to ask taxpayers for more money, especially for quote unquote administrative fees. I also appreciate that you all put a lot of time, I mean, even just here on this call today, but certainly in advance, providing what I know you hope would fulfill both your disclosure obligations surrounding the recommendation, as well as the relevant data to support the recommendation. But I have to say, I'm kind of reminded of that Tom Cruise movie, the one where he was playing a sports agent. I don't know if anybody knows the one I'm talking about. Yes, right, exactly. And he had that saying that, and I don't mean the show me the money, but one of his sayings was, help me help you. Mm-hmm. Because I would so much want to vote for this because it's so intuitively necessary. But I think, for the reasons Sonny raised and what you all clearly get, I would propose that we consider doing that not today, but perhaps at our next meeting in April, if that's still consistent with the timing of the process. I just hate to beat up whoever wrote the memo for item 11, but there's just some basic stuff a decision maker should have for assessing this that just isn't in the materials or is buried in ways that make it unnecessarily difficult to find. And so let me just ask one question which exemplifies this. I have total respect for the fact that boards and committees shouldn't be micromanaging the executive director, the CFO, or anybody else really. But I'm curious, is the information in attachment 2 for illustrative purposes, or is that the specific intent of the incremental funds against which we could audit next year?
Stuart, maybe I could take that question. So attachment 2 is specifically just to show where the additional money would be coming from. So in other words, if we're taking $3.2 million.
Sorry, maybe I referred to the wrong attachment, not the sources, but I thought that was attachment 1. I was talking about attachment 2 is the spreadsheet that shows the list of places that it seems as if the money would go, but it's not clear again if that's for illustrative purposes or if that's actually where the money will go.
Yes, actually for fiscal year 20, what that spreadsheet shows is where the money is in fiscal year 2021 and where the additional resources, the $3.2 million are proposed to go in the fiscal year 22 budget. So, our fiscal year 22 budget right now is live on our website because it's going to the executive committee on Friday, and that shows the additional resources that we're looking for, that $3.2 million, and which particular programs those are paying for.
Stuart Hopper, you are muted.
Yep, sorry. I don't know, maybe we need to take this offline because I guess I'm just a little bit confused because I'm looking at the spreadsheet that lists, for example, the 303,000 for the independent auditor and, that spreadsheet. And I think the preceding spreadsheet that shows the source of how the additional administrative funds, where they're coming from, that's very clear. But again, the one that's showing the listing of the incremental expenses or the uses of the funds, I'm just wondering again if that's how this money would be intended to be spent along those lines, or if that's, again, just illustrating the point that we need more money.
Yeah, maybe we can take this offline, Mr. Halpern, because again, the spreadsheet that I'm looking at basically shows what the budget is in 21 and what it is in 22. So the additional resources, the additional 3.2, but if it's not clearly shown, let me talk to you after the call today, if you don't mind.
If I could, I think I have kind of the same questions. For example, when you say Office of Independent Performance Auditor, 303,000 is going to be added for that, really going to that purpose, or is it showing how to spread out this $3 million or the additional money that you're asking for? Because it's not very clear how the money is being spent. Is that, George, is that kind of what you were wondering, the same thing?
Yes, so maybe we can just take that as an example. Right now the budget for the OIPA office is approximately $1 million. And we're showing that in fiscal year 22, 303,000 of the additional 3.2 that we're looking for, approximately 10% of the money would be coming from that source of money.
Okay, but how is that being spent? Is that going to be in staff and people and in equipment? I mean, I guess what's the basis for this estimate? That's what we're not seeing.
Okay.
And I agree with Stuart. Maybe we need to, do next month, get more information about it to find out. I hijacked any, but I just think I'm not clear on this as well as to how these came about, what's the purpose of it, how it's going to be used. I do agree. I think you need to look at the budget, but it's just the way this is presented is not clear enough for us to make an informed decision on behalf of the taxpayers.
Okay.
Ms. House, if I may, just to try to help bring some clarity, so as you and the rest of the committee over the course of between now and your next meeting kind of evaluate this, I'd like to just point out maybe two things about this particular spreadsheet. So this spreadsheet is looking at just the TransNet funds and their particular recommended allocation to specific projects. Those projects themselves, though, as Andre alluded to, have a myriad of funding sources. So for example, the OIPA only has a small portion from TransNet. So we are asking that we allocate 303,000 more. Now, to see the detail of how, for example, the OIPA would use those funds, like Andre said, we've got the full detailed work program for the OIPA. And there you'll see the listing of the number of staff. You'll see the specific projects and targets that they've established. And that goes for each one of the projects that are listed here. But this attachment was merely to try to help you get comfortable with the accounting of what we're recommending. But you need to look at this in the context of the full budget document against each of those projects to see what we're spending and what we're committing ourselves to you and to the board and to the public in terms of our production with that particular additional investment.
I appreciate that, Ray. Is there a way to maybe have another column to reflect some of that information as far as I mean, because you have general description of what's being done or what reason for their ask is. But, and I love the fact that you've summarized everything into a spreadsheet. I love this, you know. I don't want to read a 500-page document, but is there a way to clarify that a little bit more in the spreadsheet for the next discussion?
I think there certainly is always an opportunity to make things clearer. So we definitely hear the questions from you and Stuart. And I think we'll work as a team to figure out how we can bring that kind of clarity and not cause you to have to dig through the 500-page document of the budget, because we recognize that's a deep document. So.
Okay, I am looking for other hands from committee members who may have questions for staff. Okay. I have some questions, just probably more for Ariana than anything else. So the request here is consistent with the TransNet ordinance. There's no reason for ITOC committee to be opposed to the ask itself.
It is consistent. Yes, it is allowable under the ordinance provisions, correct.
So that is the purview of the ITOC. What is the consistency with the TransNet ordinance? As a citizen and on a Citizens Oversight Committee, I'd like to see a little bit more information about that. I was kind of disappointed we didn't get anybody to speak on this issue. It's, you know, we don't get a lot of speakers in general, but this would have been one that I thought might generate some public comment.
But wait for the board meeting.
I suspect that there'll be a lot more discussion about the finer details at other places for sure. I do want to support staff's effort. I ask my transportation colleagues for better information than the PEMS data for traffic volumes. It's good, they do a good job with it, but it's old, and there is a lot of AI work that I'd like a central organization like SANDAG to do. So, you know, my personal, professional and personal position would be, I'd support this in general. I do support the director. We have no say in hirings and firings over at SANDAG, but they did hire this guy out of LA and to do different things. And if he tells me he needs more money to do it, that seems like a reasonable request. So I would support it on those two fronts. I don't think we can necessarily get behind the 1% or the specific projects or the funding. So this is just not up to us, and there wasn't a lot of detail to support those things. But it's going to be some number, it's going to be some projects, and it's going to be somebody's going to have to foot the bill. But I suspect those issues are going to be addressed, whether we have a lot of input to those things or not, by other committees. So I think there's an opportunity for the ITOC to make a motion in support in general to right size the administrative costs with the burden that we're asking them to shoulder. If you acknowledge that they haven't had an opportunity to adjust this since inception, right? I don't think you've ever revisited your costs. And I think support at this point would be useful. We are the Citizens Committee. Every subsequent committee that's going to hear this is made up of agency representatives, and they're going to have a natural tendency to say, well, that's my agency's budget, and not support this. And as the Citizens Committee who doesn't have that burden necessarily, our voice might be helpful there. If we said we were supportive of this, acknowledging that we don't have a whole lot of information about the exact amounts and the exact allocations and projects that would be affected. So what do you think? Is there a possibility to make a motion in general support in absence of the other information, or should we wait? Question for the committee.
I would move that unless staff tells us that this would be disruptive, I would move that we consider a formal vote of support at our next meeting. I have to say, you know, I hear everything you're saying, Mike, and I respect the perspective. I guess I would just say, I'm imagining we're a Taxpayer Oversight Committee, right? I'm imagining a member of the public asking me about a vote that we might have today and saying, so you're telling me that something was posted at 9 o'clock the evening, 12 hours before your meeting. Some people probably didn't really have a chance to review it and you voted on it anyway. I just think that's kind of like, it just doesn't really quite look like we're fulfilling our obligation. And so just on that purpose alone, I would like to push it off. But I agree with everything you said about the notion of, we shouldn't be micromanaging, and that our intent is within the realm of oversight to support the goals, which I think this ultimately does. But for the reasons I described, I'd be more comfortable looking at it in April.
The timeline is certainly a consideration. From the other committee members, any comment?
Chair King, I tend to agree with Stuart. There's no reason to vote at this point. This is an item that has been received by the ITALC. We have considered it, we have discussed it. I don't know if we need a vote to send it back to the rest of the committees that are going to go through that. So,
thank you, Vice Chair House. Dustin?
I was just going to say, I agree with Stuart. If we are going to vote or make some sort of recommendation, I would just a little bit more time, a little bit more information.
Okay. Well, I think I have an understanding of how my fellow committee members think. I would certainly be interested in any more information that you might be able to offer at a subsequent meeting. Just point of reference to the other committee members, these things gain energy or they lose energy. So, we push it out a month, we push it out 2 months, then whatever we do may not have as much impact as it would have today. But I will listen to the committee members and thank you for your comments. Anybody else on the committee would like to weigh in? Okay, well, seeing none, this is a discussion item. No action to be taken, so we'll receive and file the report, and thank you very much.
Chair, you've got John Frankel.
Oh, I'm sorry. Darn it. Oh, there we go. Jonathan, if you could feel free to add your comments. Thanks.
Thank you. Just a question as to process, Ariana. So it looks like if we continue this item and consider it at our next meeting, this item will go before the board as part of the program budget on March 26th. So that would mean that that item would proceed to the board prior to us taking any sort of action or making any sort of recommendation.
Yeah, that's correct. So March 26th, the board would consider the draft budget. And remember, that's a two-step process. So the final budget would go to them later in the year as well. And we could still come back on April 14th to your next meeting with additional information that you requested today, as well as any other items that we need to bring forward. For example, an ordinance amendment for a hearing. So that could be brought forward at that time as well.
Thank you.
And I apologize, Mr. Franklin. And one last look here. Any other members? All right.
If I could, Mike, just one thing.
Sure.
A number of people have referenced additional information. From a process standpoint, Ariana, might you have a suggestion as to how we could ensure that for the next meeting, whatever questions people have get answered? Like, can we just forward to you emails of particular questions that we might have for additional information or for clarification? Would that work?
Yes, and yes, thank you. We would appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, well, thank you very much. With that, we'll move on to the next item, which I believe is item number 3. We have our standing executive director's report.
Chair Kenny,
yeah.
Apologies for interrupting, but it seems we will not have an executive director's report for today's meeting agenda after all. So with that, we would be ready to move to the consent agenda.
Perfect. So we will forego item number 3 and move on to to the consent calendars, items 4 through 7. Is there anyone from the public who would like to speak on items 4 through 7, the consent calendar?
Chair Kenny, if I may, this is Ariana again, sorry.
Again.
Back to the item that we were just hearing, item 11. Another thing that I failed to mention in answering Mr. Hopper's question, we could also offer a special meeting just for item 11 to circle back with you if that is something that the committee would like to do.
Well, that was directed to committee member Halpern. You want to answer that?
Well, what I would say is if staff feels it would be helpful for them to go to, as one of our members mentioned, to go to that board presentation with an affirmative vote from the ITOC in favor, I'd be happy to try to do a special meeting in advance to facilitate that happen, because as Mike alluded to, I think the spirit of at least sort of where I'm coming from is to be supportive. I just feel like from a governance standpoint, we probably need to do it a little bit differently or have more time before we vote. But I'd be very much in favor of a special meeting if staff says it would be helpful for their purposes.
Yes, I think that is what we are saying. So we can work with the committee members to help schedule that before your next meeting, before your next regular meeting on April 14th, if that works for everybody.
Sure.
I would make myself available.
Okay, fantastic.
I think that would be a great idea. If we do find that this is something we want to support, it's better to do it sooner.
Yes.
So a good idea. Thank you. You need anything from us to make that happen? You'll just contact us.
No, just that was good. Your concurrence is all I need. Thank you. We will schedule.
All right. So on to the consent calendar. Francesca, is there anyone who'd like to speak on items on the consent calendar?
No, Chair, I don't see any hands from the public.
Do I have to ask that for the consent calendar or not?
Yes, we do need to acknowledge public comments for consent.
All right, so the consent calendar can be taken as a whole if no members of the committee would want to pull an item. Are there any members of the committee who would like to pull or discuss an item on the consent calendar? Seeing none, we'll take the consent calendar as a whole. Is there a motion?
Chair, these actually are all information items, I believe. Ariana, can you confirm that?
Correct. We do not need it.
And we have been asking for that, and I missed it. All right. So these are all information items, and having no request to discuss, we will receive and file those items and move on to our regular calendar. Item number 8, presentation by Mr. Needham for the actions of the Transportation Committee and the Board of Directors.
Yes, thank you, Chair Kenny. So I'll be real quick. Since your February meeting, the board approved the proposed bond issuance and refunding that you heard about at your last meeting. The board also approved the commitment to equity statement that was referenced at your last meeting. And then the board was provided with a presentation about the 2021 regional plan, moving from the vision to the plan. And then this Friday, there's going to be a presentation about the funding strategies for the regional plan. And all of you should have received an invitation to participate in that meeting. So hopefully you'll be able to join us. And then at its February meeting, the board also approved the RTCIP fee adjustment, the 2021 Regional Transportation Improvement Program, or RTIP, as well as the short-term revenue forecast. All of these you saw and heard at your February meeting as well. And then the Transportation Committee recommended board approval of an increase to the Sandag Commercial Paper Program. And the board will be considering that, I believe, this Friday. And you'll be hearing more about that as part of your quarterly finance report on the financial markets as well. And that's all I have for you today.
All right, do you have any comments from the general public or from the public on that item? Item number 8.
No, Chair, I don't see any hands.
Perfect. Any questions for Ariana from the committee members? Let me check real quick before I move on. All right, seeing none, we'll receive and file that item and move on to item number 9, a presentation by Ms. Farr from with Sandag Independent Auditor's Annual Report on the results of the 2020 TransNet compliance audits. Ms. Farr.
Thank you, Chair Kenny. If I can just kick the item off. So Thank you. So the ordinance requires the ITOC to conduct an annual fiscal and compliance audit of transit recipients. Jennifer Farr, your fiscal audit, is here to present the results of the draft audit. There are two components to this item. Item A is a fiscal audit and item B is a transit operator eligibility request. So once Jennifer concludes her presentation on item 9, she'll turn it back to me to provide next steps on this item. And with that, pass it over to Jennifer. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm happy to present to you the draft of the agreed upon procedures that we performed over the TransNet funds. And this presentation will facilitate going over some of the exceptions noted during our procedures. Next slide, please. As a reminder, our agreed upon procedures is primarily to determine whether recipients of TransNet funds were in compliance with the ordinance. And we looked at the fiscal year ended June 30, 2020. Those procedures were approved by ITOC in July of 2020. We tested 24 recipient agencies in San Diego County, and we performed our audit procedures from October 2020 through January 2021. And there are 8 major compliance components that I'll go over in the next slides. One of the compliance components is testing TransNet expenditures and revenues and expenditures, and are happy to report that all recipients were in compliance with the revenue and expenditure testing that we performed. There were 3 cities that are in the process of obtaining approvals for transfers between projects that we anticipate having those approvals before we finalize the reports. Next page. The next area of maintenance of effort is a requirement that each agency maintains the same level of local discretionary funds expended for street and road purposes on average over the last 3 years. And all of the agencies were in compliance with the exception of the city of Poway. They were very close, but you can see that their discretionary expenditures did not exceed the MOE base year requirement. Next slide. Another area that we test is the local agency balance limitation. And the recipients are required to be in compliance with the 30% rule. We noted that only one agency was not in compliance with the 30% rule, and that is the city of Del Mar. And I've included the calculation on this slide. This is not exactly an instance of non-compliance. It just means that payments will be deferred until the unused balance of funds that they have falls below that 30% threshold. Next slide. The next area we test is the local street improvements split between congestion relief projects and maintenance projects. And we found that Sandag was in compliance with the requirement that at least 70% of the revenues were used for congestion relief projects. And all of the recipient agencies were in compliance with the requirements not to spend more than 30% of the funds for maintenance projects. Next slide. We also report on indirect cost. Some agencies charge indirect cost, other agencies do not. And so included in the summary report is a report for each agency of the total indirect cost charged to the TransNet program and the percentage as a percentage of the total indirect cost. And there were no substantial changes from the prior year. And this attachment E in the summary report also includes the prior year information. And we had no findings related to our indirect cost testing. The next slide. So I've got two more areas. So this is the second to last. For the Regional Transportation Congestion Improvement Program, this is where recipient agencies are collecting a minimum exaction fee from each newly constructed residential housing unit. We noted 3 agencies with compliance issues: the City of Coronado, the City of Lemon Grove, and the City of National City. In each instance, the agencies charged less than the minimum exaction fee of $2,533. And so within each report, there is information about what each agency is doing to remedy that issue. Next slide. And the last compliance area that we're reporting on in our reports, in our draft reports, is the transit operator eligibility testing. There's a test for bus and a test for rail. So in both cases, the increase in operating cost per revenue vehicle hour cannot exceed the increase in CPI. And I'll show you on the next 2 slides that CPI was actually negative for the year that we were testing. Both MTS and NCTD had compliance issues with both the bus and the rail services. Next slide. I've included here the calculation for MTS. You can see the consumer price index changed by a negative 4.96%. And then above it, the total operating cost per revenue vehicle hour for bus was an increase of 8.35%. And then down below for rail was an increase of 3.65%. This issue will be discussed as item 9B, so I won't get into too much details about it other than going to the next slide, which is NCTD's calculations. And again, you can see a similar trend with the CPI being negative and the growth rate for both bus and rail exceeding the negative. I will note that the negative amount is not the threshold for this calculation. Because it's negative, the consumer price index is considered to be 0. So the growth rate for the operating cost per revenue vehicle hour would need to be higher than 0. Next slide. Or you can actually end the presentation if you'd like. So with that, it's a quick summary of a very large report. Each agency has a detailed report, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have about the draft reports. And you can stop the PowerPoint at this point.
All right, Ms. Farr, thank you very much. Andre, anything to add?
We'll go on to the next item, but I'll just pause to see if anybody has any questions for Jennifer.
Stuart, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, thanks. You know, I seem to recall that in the past we had discussion about, I guess in a sense, either permanently excluding or accepting, depending upon how you want to look at it, the non-cash pension adjustments from the calculation. And I remember, you know, Dick Fortman, who's actually on the county pension board, was active participant in that. And like I said, I thought we had agreed that that shouldn't have to be a factor in the calculation, but maybe we did discuss it and came out in a different place. I'm just wondering, I think Jennifer, that may have been before you got onto the engagement, or if Ariana or somebody else might have any recollection of that.
I will tell you that the numbers that I showed you already include those adjustments. So there are no, the expenses have already been reduced by those non-cash issues related to both pension and other post-employment benefits.
Right, I guess I'm referring to NTDS's letter wherein they reference specifically the non-cash adjustment of 2.8 million as an adjustment to the formula. But I guess I was thinking that they don't need to adjust the formula because we've already changed our definition of what the formula is. So do you understand what I'm asking? Maybe I'm not being clear.
Well, pensions are an allowable exclusion, right? The pension costs. So, and I think what Jennifer was saying is that that is already included as part of the calculation. So it is consistent with what the ordinance allows, right, to be excluded as a cost. I'm not sure if that helps answer.
Yeah, I guess maybe it's just that in NCTD's letter there, they seem to be requesting that it be excluded, unless I'm reading the letter wrong, which they don't, I thought we agreed they don't need to do. But maybe I'm just reading their letter wrong. So, okay, as long, but I think we're all on the same page that we're not including pension adjustments as part of the formula.
Ariana, this is you from NCTD. I do recall we had this conversation last year, and there have been a proposal to include in the ordinance by default an exclusion. But my understanding is that we never reach a consensus, and therefore we have to request it every year.
Okay.
And Mr. Reference, this is Amberlyn, legal counsel, just to clarify that the ordinance has not been amended to provide for an automatic exclusion. However, the ordinance language does allow the board of directors to consider that as a type of exclusion, which is why it's reflected in NCTD's letter.
Well, to be clear, I wasn't referring to the notion of seeking permission broadly when they exceed the CPI, but just specifically, I thought we had adjusted the formula so that the pension adjustment portion itself would be excluded from the calculation. Anyway, we're in some minutia territory here. We can probably take this offline.
Okay, so any more questions for staff on 9A? Just actually check before I don't see any. So Andre, if you could continue.
Chair Kenny?
Sir, or I'm sorry, ma'am.
So we do need an action to accept the draft fiscal audit. I don't know if you want to take that vote now, separate from the 9B portion of the discussion.
So they're two distinct items and not related in that?
Yeah, and maybe here General Counsel Amberlyn can help out with that too.
Chair, it's at your discretion. The items can be taken as one vote, which would include the acceptance and a potential recommendation, or if the committee prefers, it can be split into two votes with item A and item B being voted on separately.
Okay. My understanding was this was a two-part item and that we were taking questions on the first part and we would have questions on the second, a call for the public, then discussion and a singular vote. So that's my thought. I appreciate that we do need to accept item 9A. Is 9B it also could have an action. So let's have one action on the two.
All right, Chair, so would you like me to begin on 9B?
Yes, please.
All right, so as you heard in the last report, one of the auditor's procedures is to check compliance of the various ordinance requirements of the transit operators in the local jurisdiction, so they may continue receiving their annual TransNet allocations. And for fiscal year 20 audit, both MTS and NCTD have an unmet requirement needing additional steps to cure. So on an annual basis, section 4C5 of the ordinance requires the transit operators to hold costs for both bus and rail services to CPI, which is used as a measure to help keep costs reasonable year over year. The CPI is that is used applies to San Diego County, and it is transportation specific. The CPI for fiscal year 20 decreased by 4.96%. However, for NCTD, the operating cost per revenue vehicle mile for rail services increased by 10.84%. And for MTS, the operating cost per revenue vehicle hours for bus services increased by 8.35%. And revenue vehicle miles for the rail services increased by 3.65%. The ordinance takes into consideration years in which this occurs and provides a few options for board consideration. Transit operators may exclude certain unforeseen costs, and we've already gone a little bit into that. They may use an average over a 3-year period, or they may use a combination of the two methods. So per section 4C5 of the ordinance, both NCTD and MTS are requesting to recalculate their fiscal year 20 operating costs using cost exclusions and the 3-year average methods as described in attachments 2 and 3 respectively. Specifically, MTS is asking to approve the 3-year average comparison relative to trolley operations and to calculate annual eligibility excluding COVID-related service reductions for bus operations. And for NCTD, they are asking to exclude certain costs resulting from an adjustment from actuarial estimates for NCTD's CalPERS pension liability, other post-employment benefits, third-party claims liabilities, and workers' compensation reserves liability, as well as COVID-related service impacts. So other than the COVID-related impacts, these types of exclusions have been requested in the past and approved by the board. So we do have a recommendation with this item. The ITAC is asked to, 1, consider the TransNet funding eligibility requests of the North County Transit District and the San Diego Metropolitan Transit System, and 2, to make a recommendation to the Board of Directors acting as the San Diego County Regional Transportation Commission regarding this request. And we do have representatives from both MTS and NCTD available if you have any questions. And with that, that concludes my report. I turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nuncio. Clerk, do we have any members of the public who'd like to speak on either of these two issues or either of these two items, 9A and 9B?
No, Chair, I don't see any hands from the public.
Okay. Do we have any questions for staff or for the transit representatives from the committee? Seeing none, I'd entertain a motion, and I apologize for making it a complex motion, but please address the report in 9A and the recommendations in 9B in the motion. Anybody up for the challenge?
I would move that we accept the audit, recommend its approval by the board if that's what's required, as well as accept and recommend the 2 exceptions from MTS and NCTD.
Okay, just to clarify, that's to recommend to the board to do that. Thank you. Do we have a second?
Chair Kenny, I second, but I would like to hear from both MTS and NCTD before we vote. I didn't get a chance to raise my hand first.
Certainly. All right, so we have a motion and a second. Francesca, if you could call for the vote, please.
No, before we vote, can we first hear?
I'm sorry, you broke up in that in your last
All
comment
right.
there. Could you repeat it for me?
I just said I second the motion, but I would like to hear from NCTD and MTS about this request and the circumstances before we vote.
Okay, we'll just do that. So Jose, if you could introduce or point out the representatives from the transit agencies for me.
Sure, we'll begin with MTS, Mike Thompson.
Mr. Thompson, welcome.
Good morning. My name is Mike Thompson. I'm the Director of Financial Planning and Analysis for MTS. I'm sitting in for Larry Marinisi, our CFO. And the basic request is, we had 2 different years last year in fiscal year 20. We had a first part of the year where everything's operating normally. We're actually on track to meet our metrics for both bus and rail. And then we have the COVID part of the year. And in the middle of that year, we actually did receive a large federal stimulus funding for the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or CARES Act. And part of that act gave us funding to do a lot of additional cleaning and personal protective equipment type stuff that we do now going forward. And then also authorized us to keep as much service on the street as possible for our essential workers, for the community to allow as much social distancing as possible, and also to maintain our employment levels. So basically in the middle of the year, once that was approved, we kept all staff at current levels, no furloughs or anything. But we did have to reduce service levels a little bit from the April to June timeframe because we just didn't have enough operators to actually operate full levels of service. So the request is on the bus side is to use that equivalent level of service that sort of ties to the staffing levels and then allows us to be compliant. And on the rail side is to use the 3-year averaging for that piece. So that's the basic story. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mike, for the explanation. I'm just wondering, going forward for the new year, are you seeing the same challenges, or how does that work?
We will probably have some similar challenges. We do have much more service on the street now. We put all basically, well, not quite full service levels, but a much greater level of service back on the street, basically right before July 1. We still have certain routes that are like commuter type routes tied to employment that are reduced at this point in time, but the trolley is running at basically full service levels, and majority of buses running at full service levels. So from that perspective, we won't have this issue next year, but we'll have to see what costs look like and what CPI look like. A negative 5% CPI seems very surprising on our side when we have minimum wage pressures and all the additional costs. You can't even get a mask for under $5. You know, all these things are just the negative CPI thing didn't really make sense to us. So we'll see what that looks like.
Thank you so much.
And if no other questions, I'd like to introduce Yoon Park Lynch from the North County Transit District.
Good morning. My name is, thank you. Good morning. My name is Yoon Park Lynch. I am the Chief Financial Officer for the North County Transit District. So along those lines, like Mike mentioned, obviously there have been significant impacts on ridership since March when the stay-at-home orders were enacted. We have also invested a significant amount of dollars in enhanced cleaning, masks. We provide masks in all our buses. So when there are riders that don't bring their own, we hand those masks ourselves. We have also installed protective barriers in our breeze routes to ensure that our drivers are protected from the general public. As far as service is related, the service that has been the most impacted from COVID from NCT standpoint has been our coaster service and our paratransit services, right? A lot of the commuters that traditionally go either south to San Diego or north have been those that have been allowed to work remotely. So we had a significant impact on coaster ridership up to close to 90% right at the peak of the pandemic. For our bridge services, we did not have significant cancellations of service. However, because schools were out, we had to cancel all the class trippers and all those routes that serve schools. So when you look at the report from Davis Far, you will notice that there's a significant reduction on the level of hours of service and miles for our trains due to, reducing, how many trains we are running on any weekday. So within our request, kind of voicing at some point in time, we have brought up to the commission whether there was any possibility of revising the CPI that's used for TransNet purposes. The CPI that's used for TransNet purposes is a transportation CPI. So that one is skewed based on transportation costs, including fuel. And as you know, obviously during the pandemic, fuel costs have come down because of lower demand. But from the day-to-day operations for NCTD and for MTS, our costs are going to increase either through collective bargaining agreements, in the case of MTS. In the case of NCTD, we contract out our services for both bus and rail, and we utilize a different CPI than the CPI that's used for TransNet. And that CPI for fiscal year 2020 was 3%. So, right there, you're going to have a big difference between the negative and zero for TransNet versus the 3%, which you have committed with our contracts. And our contracts are long-term contracts, traditionally base term of 7 years. So we are, each time or every year, there's a big discrepancy between those CPIs, we're going to fall out of compliance. So, and then on the third requirement, obviously, because we have fixed price contracts for rail services and 25% of our costs for bus services fixed as well. And given that we received the additional federal support through CARES Act, we were able to maintain those operators employed even as services were reduced. So definitely this has been a challenging year, very unusual. Nobody could have anticipated, 1 year ago, the impacts that we're feeling today, and not just NCTD or MCS, but really across the nation, where we're hoping that ridership will recover gradually as vaccination rates increase. But again, a very unusual year and unprecedented.
Is there any tune of going back with your contractors and renegotiating because of the circumstances, so that you can maybe reduce the disparity between what, the index and that in the contract?
Typically, these contracts go out to bid. They follow a procurement process, and within the, these are very, very complex contracts. There is an operational component as well as a maintenance component. So contractors need some certain level of certainty, right? They need to know what are your planned service needs in the future, and trying to get some flexibility. Again, we hope this is a temporary issue, and hopefully ridership will recover. But at the same time, we have to be cognizant that we had, essential workers still working through a difficult time. And given that we received this additional financial support from the CARES Act, we were able to keep these operators employed.
Well,
so these are.
I'm sorry. What I'm suggesting is not unprecedented. Some of the other agencies have actually done that, have gone back and asked their consultants and contractors to come up with reductions and things like that. So, but I understand. Thank you for your explanation.
Quick question for Jose. When was the discussion about the CPI as it pertains to our transit members reporting? When did that happen? Was that a year, 3 years ago, 2 years ago?
You mean as part of the last audit, triennial audit that we did?
Was it the last triennial audit?
No, I was, as Yun was mentioning that, I was trying to remember when that was brought up initially. And I recall that we've had some discussions. I'm sorry to say I'm blanking on what the outcome of those discussions was. So I don't know if Ariana or Andre or anyone recalls that, but I do remember that has come up and we have discussed it.
Yeah,
as far as my memory is taking me.
Your FY18 audit had a recommendation to revisit the CPI and the threshold and the requirements under that section 4C5. And you formed a subcommittee to look into that a little bit more. And the subcommittee came back saying that there wasn't really a strong case for making any changes to that ordinance requirement, that the ITOC would prefer. And ITOC actually received an update on that probably about a year ago, I want to say, where they felt that it's still very valuable to have the transit operators come to the ITOC and provide their justification for requesting these exceptions, and that the ITOC values hearing that. So I think that might answer your question.
That's jogging my memory as well. So I think that the ITOC had a preference for, instead of giving some sort of an automatic, they would rather hear from the transit operators in terms of, what are the issues that you guys are facing. And I think at the time the ITOC chose to kind of leave the metric alone.
So I seem to recall the discussion. I don't recall participating in any action, but I was around for the discussion. And if it was part of the 2018 triennial audit, it probably predates myself and many of the current members.
And I see that Stuart has his hand up, so he may recall what the discussion was about.
Yeah, thank you. I was just going to say that was actually the basis of that question that I asked somewhat inappropriately in 9A, which is really a 9B question. But yeah, I was a participant in that subcommittee, and I think Ariana summarized it well, that we did discuss it, Mike, at the time, and the feeling was that it's respecting the time of both agencies, but at the same time shouldn't be an overly burdensome thing just to come back and do that quick report. But like I said, I did have a vague recollection that we might have agreed to accept the pension change, but maybe the outcome was that we just took no action. So there is that history.
Yeah, the reason I ask is that there has been a lot of discussion, excuse me. Well, not a lot of discussion, but there has been some discussion about this issue with the ITOC and our transit members before. And so there's a little history there that maybe the newer ITOC members don't know. So maybe next time we could just revisit that for the new members so they can appreciate what the transit agencies are doing for us. All right, so we have a motion on the floor and a second. Any other comments before we entertain the vote? Okay, seeing none, I'd ask the clerk to call for the vote, please.
Thank you, Chair. For real estate right-of-way acquisition, Jonathan Frankel.
Yes.
Thank you. For licensed civil traffic engineer, Chair Kenny.
Yes.
Thank you. For contractor construction, Brad Barnum.
Yes.
Thank you. For biology environmental, Dustin Fuller.
Yes.
Thank you. For finance budgeting, Stuart Halpern.
Yes.
Thank you. Licensed engineer Les Hopper is absent. And for CEO private sector, Vice Chair House. Thank you very much. And that does pass with those members present.
All right, thank you very much. We'll move on to item number 12, which is a presentation about the Cycle 11 call for projects for our senior mini grant funding recommendation. Mr. Rivera available.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, Chair and members of the ITOC. I'm here today to discuss the Senior Mini Grant Funding Recommendations to the Specialized Transportation Grant Program, or an acronym here, STGP, the Cycle 11 Call for Projects. Next slide. So, but first, a little background on the STGP. The STGP is comprised of the Federal Transit Administration Section 5310 program and the TransNet Senior Mini Grant Program. Taken together, the STGP seeks to improve mobility for seniors and individuals with disabilities when other transportation options are unavailable or inappropriate. This is accomplished by removing barriers to transportation services, expanding transportation mobility options, and providing transportation services that meet the special needs of seniors and individuals with disabilities. Next slide. About every 2 years, SANDAG holds a competitive process or call for projects to disperse 2 years of Section 5310 and senior mini grant funding for projects that further the program goal and objectives. The projects are scored based on eligibility and evaluation criteria set by the board with input from the ITOC, from the Transportation Committee and other specialized transportation stakeholders. Next slide. So SANDAG is in the midst of the Cycle 11 call for projects. Before I discuss the results of the call specific to the Senior Mini Grant Program, here's a summary of the key activities that led to this point. We started this process around this time last year and came to this committee in early July 2020 with draft eligibility and evaluation criteria. We then presented the evaluation criteria to the Transportation Committee and the Board of Directors. Following board approval, we released the call for projects on July 31st of 2020. Once the call closed on October 30th, SANDAG reviewed proposals from 12 nonprofit organizations and local agencies that collectively requested about $4.1 million in senior mini grant funding. Once staff had ensured that the minimum eligibility requirements had been met, the projects were sent to evaluators external to SANDAG to review and score. Staff then developed draft project rankings and funding recommendations, conducted a social equity analysis of the funding recommendations, and completed a quality assurance review to identify any errors. Next slide. So the senior mini grant draft funding recommendations, STGP Cycle 11 call for projects, are included in attachment 1 of the staff report. As a result of this process, 9 projects are collectively recommended to receive $3.3 million in available senior mini grant funding. Project descriptions of the recommended projects are listed in attachment 2 of the staff report. They include support for volunteer driver programs, information and referral services, and include subsidies for on-demand transportation. All recommended projects advance the STGP goal and objectives, align with the priorities identified in the coordinated plan, and show broad geographic coverage. On this map, the green shaded areas represent the service areas of projects recommended for funding. The darker the shade of green, the higher number of projects that would serve that area. Additionally, red dots represent the number of low-income households, where 1 dot equals 100 low-income households. Blue dots represent the region's minority population, where 1 dot is equivalent to 300 people. As I mentioned earlier, a social equity analysis was conducted of the draft senior mini grant and section 5310 funding recommendations, as detailed in attachment 3 of the staff report. No disproportionate effects for low-income populations or disparate impacts for minority populations were found. Next slide. So, and for next steps, staff will bring the draft funding recommendations to the Transportation Committee at its March 19th meeting, and the board is slated to consider approval of the funding recommendations on March 26th. Pending board approval, the projects will be programmed into the Regional Transportation Improvement Program, or RTIP, in April. Senior mini grant agreements would no sooner than July 20 of this calendar year. For continuation projects, grant agreements would be executed on a rolling basis as cycle 10 senior mini grant projects are completed. And with that, I welcome any questions that the committee may have at this time.
All right, Mr. Rivera, thank you very much. Do we have any members from the public who'd like to speak on this issue, Francesca?
No, Chair, I don't see any hands from the public.
Okay, back to committee for discussion. Do we have any questions for Zachary? Looking for hands. I don't see any hands. So, oh, I'm sorry. I do see a hand, Mr. Halpern.
I didn't want to disappoint you. So one question, well, first a comment, you know, Zach, we've seen you over a number of years, and I just want to compliment you and the team on the really great improvements in the quality of the presentation. You know, I think the mapping and I don't know if Ray's team has had a hand in that, but really, really great presentation. The one thing I would ask, and I do very much appreciate the comments about equity and recognizing that you're only dealing with the grant proposals that you get and that you've gone really far to promote fairness in the awards.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way that you, in overlaying the services that will be provided, even as far as you've gone to try to ensure no disparities, I imagine that there's not 100% coverage, right? Because there's probably just not enough money for that. What happens in those areas where there actually isn't as much coverage as there is need?
Yeah, so a couple of points. So first, there are providers that are county-wide, so they should be able to receive some service. There are some areas that will receive more service because there are more service providers that overlap, so there are more choices. To your point about social equity, that's something that I know that the agency has put more emphasis on, and will be looking at that in terms of the grant programs, in terms of how, instead of just meeting the minimum requirements of no disparate impacts, how we really look at all the funding recommendations holistically Hopefully that helps to answer some of your questions, Mr. Halpern.
Yes, thank you. Appreciate it.
Any other questions for Mr. Rivera? Okay, so this is a discussion item and staff is asking for a recommendation to the board for support of the proposed mini grant project. Is that correct?
Yeah, so if I may,
I'm sorry,
Chair.
Zachary.
If I may, Chair, I think the recommendation is just to review the projects that are included to make sure that they're consistent with the TransNet ordinance. And then this will be taken to the Transportation Committee for recommendation to the board.
So entertain a motion to recommend consistency with the ITOC ordinance or with the TransNet ordinance. How about I make that motion? I'd like to make a motion that we recommend the projects are consistent with the TransNet ordinance.
Second.
Motion and a second. Any discussion? Francesca, if you could call for the vote, please.
Thank you, Chair. For real estate right-of-way acquisition, Jonathan Frankel.
Yes.
Thank you. For licensed civil traffic engineer, Chair Kenny.
Yes.
Thank you. For contractor construction, Brad Barnum.
Yes.
Thank you. For biology environmental, Dustin Fuller.
Yes.
Thank you. For finance budgeting, Stuart Halpern.
Yes.
Thank you. Licensed engineer Les Hopper is absent. And for CEO private sector, Vice Chair House.
Yes.
Thank you. And that does pass with those members present.
All right. Thank you very much. That takes us on to item number 13, which is an information only item to be presented by Ms. Culp, the Regional Bikeway Program Status Report. Linda, how are you?
Hi, good morning. I'm fine. Thank you, Chair. Nice to be here with you again to give you a regular status update on our Regional Bikeway Program. Next slide. This slide just gives you the Regional Early Action Program map. All told, we're working on more than 20 projects. We have built and opened 12 miles, and we'll talk about those. Another 13 miles in construction. I'll give you some progress updates there. And we have about more than 30 miles ready to go into construction pending permits and approvals. Next slide. This chart just gives you an update graphically on those miles. So we're working on 63 of the 70 in the EAP. Happy to say that since you last saw this last fall, we've moved 3 miles from construction into the project complete part, and we'll talk about that. And that's a section of our inland rail trail. And we have a number of miles right now. We are working on final design. As I said, later on this year, we plan to have advertising for construction. Next slide. I think just a word about, how we design our projects and who we're designing for, and really where we think we'll be successful as a program is designing for that all ages and all abilities segment of our visitors and residents. And so to create this sort of network of safer and separated facilities is where we do see we'll be successful. Next slide. So I'd like to give you some progress in terms of our construction projects, but I will say there's one common theme you'll see in all the photos and all the updates, and that's not just paint for our projects, not just striping and paint. We have a number of civil improvements. It could be retaining walls, bridges you see, neighborhood traffic circles, and other traffic calming, separating those people in the bikeway from the rest of the travel lanes. So that'll be sort of a common theme as we run through. So next slide. First in the city of San Diego is our Rose Creek Bikeway. This is 2 miles of separated or class 1 facility adjacent to our Mid-Coast trolley corridor, and it actually is one of our Mid-Coast family of projects. Next slide. And I joke that my favorite construction picture is of paving, because that means we're almost done and we're almost open. And so that's the case with Rose Creek Bikeway. And this is along Santa Fe Drive, and you can see on the left-hand side beyond the fence, that's Interstate 5, just to orient you. Next slide. The snapshot of the project, 2 miles, as I mentioned, in the city of San Diego, 99% complete. And the most recent estimate I've seen from the construction side is April. So we're very, very close to opening this. This is a heavily used corridor now. If you're on your bikes, this is the main way that you travel from, downtown area, Mission Bay area, up into the University Town Center and UCSD area. So it'll be very nice to have this open. I'll show these banana charts. You've seen them before, but that shows you the relationship of how much time we're taking and how complete we are. And overall, this project, has been going very well for a while, and we're going to be very happy to have it open. Next slide. Heading up to North County area and our inland rail trail, a couple photographs of the 3-mile segment that we just opened in January, and that's a portion in the county of San Diego and the city of Vista. And you can see in the left-hand photo just how close we are to the Sprinter rail corridor in some spots. And then we did, because of our virtual nature these days, we did have a virtual ribbon cutting on our social media pages, and that's the graphic on the right-hand side. So very nicely done, and so happy to have that open as of late January. Next slide. And then heading back down to the city of San Diego to give you an update on our Georgia Mead and Landis bikeways. And Georgia Mead is there in the green, and purple line is our Landis bikeway. Very dense area of the city of San Diego, lots of schools. You can see all those triangles, those are actually schools, couple big transit plazas. So very excited to have these projects underway. Next slide. And this gives you a rendering of one of the intersections, one of the 19 neighborhood traffic circles that we're building as part of these 2 corridors. And so you can kind of see how everything's going to work together in terms of slowing traffic down, putting in the pedestrian improvements, the bikeway improvements, just making it safer for everyone using that roadway. So that's a rendering when we finish. And here are a couple of construction photos. And you can see on the right, one of our neighborhood traffic circles constructed, what those look like. Next slide. Additional one on the left-hand side, and something I want to spend just a couple minutes about on the right-hand side, and that's what we call a bend out. That is an intersection improvement, and it's kind of like a pop out where you pop out that corner, you shorten the distance that the pedestrians have to traverse to get across the street, but at the same time, that colored concrete portion, that's a portion of the bikeway. So I'm on my bike, and I head up, I go up to the raised area of that bulb out, and then I just continue on my way across the street. So it is another safer facility, a separated facility, something new that's in the city of San Diego. So excited to see this one on the ground. Next slide. Snapshot of these bikeways, 6.5 miles in the city. We're about halfway complete, making real good progress on this one. And we'll have this open by this time next year. Next slide. Also in the city of San Diego is the first segment of our Uptown Bikeways project, and that's along 4th and 5th Avenues. Next slide. This is also rendering when we're finished what this will look like. And this is, we're on 5th Avenue right now. We're looking north up into the Bankers Hill and Hillcrest area. And you can see kind of from left to right, you can see the separated bikeway on the left-hand side or the west side of the street. That raised median, those separators that separate the people on their bikes from the travel lanes, additional pedestrian improvements. In the case of Bankers Hill, additional amenities like additional plants and trees and that kind of thing. Next slide. Shows you some of the actual construction, some of the intersection improvements, constructing that raised median. And on that right-hand photo where the construction worker is standing, that's the bikeway portion of the project. Next slide. Some drainage improvements. As I mentioned, we're not just about striping and paint, but we are making a lot of drainage improvements in a lot of cases. And then on the right-hand side is the more finished bikeway portion, and that's closer to the downtown area. If you're at the 401B building, for example, and you head up 5th, you'll see that kind of improvement already. Next slide. A snapshot of this project, 4.5 miles in the city of San Diego, more than a third of the way done, making good progress. We have a little slow start last summer. We actually got out there in physical construction in August, but the team is making real good progress right now. Next slide. Jim touched upon this in the previous item related to the triennial audit. But one thing that I haven't been able to give you a lot of great progress on, but we have talked about it several times in these updates, is continuing to work with the city of San Diego. And right now we have 8 projects. Some have been there quite a while. In fact, Pershing Bikeway been there over 2 years in the permit process. And so I'll just echo Jim's comments earlier and regarding that last bullet on the slide is just a sea change this calendar year. With the city proposing a greatly streamlined process, not only for the projects that have been at the city for a while, but also moving forward, because we are holding a couple of additional bikeway designs pending resolution of the new process. So we're ready to go with a couple more bike projects. And it's real nice to see that. And we are working on the details right now, but like I said, echo Jim's enthusiasm for those changes. Next slide. Another bit of good news we just found out last month is that our Orange Bikeway, which is also in that Mid-City, North Park Mid-City family of projects, is slated to receive a $4.3 million active transportation program grant award from the state. That'll cover majority of the construction of that project, and it's great to have that project awarded construction. That is pending approval from the city. That's one that we have queued up, ready to go over. Next slide. Talked about an info bit that Sandag produced last August, September, and that showed a significant increase of people biking during the pandemic over the previous year. And our monitoring program that we continue to look at 9 different regional bike corridors and measure counts of people biking shows us a similar trend. So for example, 31% increase in the number of bike trips in 2020 over 2019. So we'll continue this monitoring. We, as I said, monitor these 9 corridors, and we can talk more details at a future meeting if you're interested. Next slide, please. I might just conclude a couple more points. One, what we'll be working on coming up the next few months is definitely opening up the Rose Creek Bikeway to the public, working more on that streamlined city process that we've talked about. And one mention is attachment A to your staff report. That was per your discussion last fall when we talked about the regional bike program, wanting that kind of cross-reference between the original early action program and where we are now. So we put that table together. Also, we put that together to support the 2021 audit that you talked about earlier. So that also closely matches that bar chart I had earlier in the presentation. So we'll stop there, and happy to take any comments or questions that you have.
Well, thank you very much. Do we have any members of the public who would like to speak on this issue?
I don't see any hands from the public.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions for Ms. Culp from the committee members?
Just a comment to thank Linda for doing the snapshot and the summary. I think it's really helpful to see where everything is. And maybe have it set up so that everything is completed is on top, and then kind of go from there as far as date of completion would be nice, so that we can kind of see where things are lagging. So, but thank you, Linda.
Yeah,
that looks good.
I see a hand up, Stuart.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to reiterate Sunny's comments. Thank you, Linda, for taking on all the feedback we've provided. The one question I had, though, was I think it was October, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, that we had representatives of the city come in to speak about where they were. And like you, they expressed great optimism about their expectations for their approval process to become much smoother, more expedited. And they said that they were hoping that, by around this time that they would really have things kind of working like the maybe well-oiled machine is too ambitious a characterization. But I'm just curious if at this point, are you tracking like days to approval? Is there any kind of metric that you're using that can actually really document the approval times and the improvement, if you're seeing it, you know, in reality, or is it just kind of, it feels like it's working better? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. You know, the first 3 projects, and thank you for the question, the first 3 projects that were approved took about 14 months. So, and as Jim mentioned, I think our optimism when we started the AP, some feedback we had initially was about 6 months we would be in review. So we didn't make that just out of the gate. And so we have not seen that improvement. As I mentioned, Pershing Bikeway being there over 2 years, definitely have not improved on the 14-month by any stretch. But I think with the change in leadership and with the process that, you know, we did not propose, the city, you know, took it upon themselves to propose that and to greatly accelerate not only working through the process, because we've had pretty much weekly meetings for the past few weeks, but also just having a very aggressive schedule that's very positive from our standpoint. Like I said, not only getting out the 8 that we have over there, but what's the path forward for the next round that we want to continue on with the review. So I'm optimistic as Jim is, and we'll be tracking those kind of metrics moving forward in the new process. We're not quite there yet.
Got it. So you're saying that you actually have sort of like milestones, and there are dates attached to milestones, so you'll be able to in kind of real time be tracking progress?
Yes, and you know, we when we started the first few projects that I've mentioned, mainly those ones in construction, are pretty much locally funded with our local TransNet ordinance. But we've been successful at leveraging those local dollars to attract those ATP grants from the state and federal sources. So now that on that list of reviews are several grant projects that have you know, timely use of funds. And so those are the next round that we want to be sure we meet those milestones coming up, because we definitely want to use the other people's money to go into construction, and we don't want to lose that. We don't want a black eye for any future grants that we might go for and that kind of thing. So that's why it's even more important now to have the streamlined process so we can be successful in those ATP grant projects.
Cool. Well, that's welcome news. You know, one thing, just a suggestion, maybe consider at the next time you come back, if there's a way that you can illustrate, you know, sort of like screenshot of your project management sort of system, or even just like a summarization of that new milestone like process. Because obviously, you know better than any of us, this is an area that, you know, the public and everybody's kind of, you know, had a little bit of frustration about. And if you can really just illustrate to people in that way that you actually do have a new system that provides greater transparency, greater accountability, you know, I think everybody, not just on this committee, but a lot of people would just love to see that in a visual way if there's a way to present it.
Okay, yeah, we'll work on that.
Thank you.
Mr. Franco, I see your hands up.
Thanks so much, Linda. Thank you so much for this update. I think that this is one of the programs that I'm most excited about and interested in as a cyclist. In fact, I was this past weekend, I went from La Mesa down University, and I saw a lot of opportunities there. I mean, road width is certainly there. I think in many places, on-street parking is located in ways that just preclude safe cycling. And so I'm really excited to see the improvements in North Park and in other places. And I just think it's really critical to meeting, certainly in the city of San Diego and elsewhere in the region, critical climate action goals, and encouraging people to get out of single occupancy vehicles, and finding a safe way to do that is really, really important. I wanted to ask you about interactions with DSD in the city of San Diego, and if there was any kind of principal reason in your mind as to delays. You know, as it seems like you're getting into final engineering. Obviously, anytime you're opening a street with utility relocations and existing infrastructure, cost increases and delays are very common. But if there was one or two things you could say in your mind that would improve your ability to get through the design at the city, what would those things be?
Thank you for that question. And I think part of the DSD challenge is just a resource issue for the city. I mean, that's the same department that reviews thousands of developer permits every year, other kind of permits, not just Sandag. And so I think it's a staffing challenge for DSD a lot of times. I also feel that, that bend out photo that I showed you in North Park, where the bicyclists will come up on the sidewalk level and continue on. That's one of these many features that the city did not have standards for. So it's difficult for them to reviewing and providing comments if they didn't have a standard for that. So I think that caused a lot of delays. We did some things that are talked about in the audit to try to bring the city along and provide guidance and national and federal and state guidance and that kind of thing. And so I think we had varying degrees of success with that. The new streamlined process that the city has proposed is to no longer go through Development Services Division, but go through their Engineering and Capital Projects Division. And so they have city engineers over there, experts over there. And so that hopefully will take it away from all those other things that DSD is charged with doing and put it over, give it a little more focus. So that's our hope.
Thank you.
Any more questions for Ms. Culp? Seeing none, I want to thank you very much for your report. As it's an information only item, we'll receive and file that. Look forward to seeing you next time. Item number 14 is continued public comments. Francesca, are there any members of the public who would like to speak on items that are not on the agenda?
No, Chair, I don't see any hands raised.
All right, so we will conclude item 14 and take us to item 15, which is our upcoming meeting, and it's listed here as Wednesday, April 14th at 9:30. Is that still correct, Ariana?
Yes, Chair Kenny, that's correct. And we will work to schedule your special meeting between now and then as well.
Perfect. What does this estimated start time 12:05 mean? Oh, that's the item itself. Never mind, that confused me. All right, so we will see everybody in April, Wednesday, April 14th in the morning. And with that, I'll adjourn the meeting. And just a special thanks to Jose for your years of service. It was a pleasure working with you, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'll miss you all. Thank you.